All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 73 for April 2025. 4 Naval Heroes: Isaac Hull, David Connor, Sylvanus Godon, and George Melville. Laurel Hill East is a National Historic Landmark, an arboretum, a sculpture garden, a nature preserve, and an active cemetery in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It opened in 1836 and remains a popular visiting spot for tens of thousands of visitors every year. Its sister cemetery, Laurel Hill West, located across the Schuylkill River in Ballackinwood, was founded in 1869. It has a history and a population of its own. I am Dr. Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine at Temple University in Philadelphia, volunteer tour guide at Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West, and volunteer podcaster. If you're a fan of All Bones Considered and Biographical Bites from Bala, my first book of biographical sketches is being released by Brookline Books on September 13th. It is called, no surprise, All Bones Considered, 52 Laurel Hill Women. I think it's going to be an ideal addition to the library of anyone who likes short biographies, Philadelphia or U.S. history, and of course women's history. I hope it is the first in a series of 4 books to be released over the next 5 years. I've got some book signings arranged in October. Several author events have been lined up with historical societies. I will share them with you as the time comes closer. In the meantime, you can check out the favorable pre-publication write-up I got from Kirkus Review. The April 2025 episode of All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, tells of 4 19th century naval heroes. The entire podcast is available on April 1st. Each segment will be released as an individual recording in the days that follow. First, I will give you some background on the history of the United States Navy and how it almost did not happen. Our first naval hero is Isaac Hull, who led USS Constitution to victory over HMS Guerriere in the early days of the War of 1812. Fellow tour guide Russ Dodge wrote this script, but declined the opportunity to narrate it. David Connor worked with Winfield Scott to arrange the largest amphibious assault of the 19th century at Vera Cruz during the Mexican-American War. Then we hear about Sylvanus Godon, who, while serving in the African Squadron, captured the slave ship Erie, which led to the return of nearly 900 Africans to their home continent and the hanging of Lucky Nat Gordon, the only man to be executed by the government for buying and selling human beings. And lastly, it's George Melville, a genius engineer and Arctic explorer who was among the survivors of the doomed USS Jeannette mission in 1879-1881. 4 men who spent their lives on the ocean and had startling tales to tell of their adventures. In this month's episode of All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 73, 4 naval heroes: Isaac Hull, David Connor, Sylvanus Godon, and George Melville. This podcast is an early 250th birthday wish to the United States Navy. It's an organization that seems like the country tried to avoid. The U.S. Navy was officially established on October 13, 1775. On the same day, the Continental Congress authorized the purchase of 2 vessels to be used for privateering against British merchant ships. Later, December 13, 1775, Congress approved the construction of 13 frigates, 5 with 32 guns, 5 with 28 guns, and 3 with 24 guns. Recently promoted Brigadier General Benedict Arnold ordered the construction of 12 naval vessels on Lake Champlain, an area that's often referred to as the Sixth Great Lake. He was attempting to impede British forces that were trying to enter New York from Canada. By the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, many more ships, including the 13 frigates authorized by Congress, were under construction. The term frigate originated in the Mediterranean in the late 15th century. It initially described a galley-type warship equipped with oars, sails, and light armament, designed for speed and maneuverability. In the second quarter of the 18th century, the true frigate was developed in France, distinguished by having only one deck which was fully armed, with the deck below designated for crew berthing. Despite the considerable efforts of the new nation, these vessels proved ineffective against the superior British Royal Navy. By 1781, the entire collection of U.S. Navy ships had been sunk or captured. Congress did issue nearly 1,700 letters of marque to American seamen, which authorized private individuals, known as privateers or corsairs, to attack and capture vessels of the British enemy. Private ships were evaluated by the government's Admiralty Course for condemnation and transfer of ownership to the privateer. If that sounds like legal piracy, you are correct. Piracy is an act of robbery and violence at sea without government authorization. Pirates operate independently. They're considered criminals under international law. In contrast, a privateer has legal immunity for actions against enemy vessels. And during the war, American privateers captured more than 2,200 British merchant ships, worth nearly $66 million. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 ended the Revolutionary War. By 1785, the Continental Navy was disbanded, and the remaining ships were sold. The frigate Alliance, which fired the last shots of the American Revolutionary War, was the final ship in the Navy. After the Revolutionary War, the United States faced financial challenges. Without an income tax, national revenue primarily came from tariffs on imported goods, which were frequently evaded through smuggling. To address this, Congress, prompted by Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, established the Revenue Marine in 1790. This organization was a precursor to the United States Coast Guard. From 1790 until the creation of the Navy Department in 1797, the 10 cutters of the Revenue Marine made up the sole armed maritime service for the entire nation. A cutter is a single-masted boat with 2 or more headsails. It is built for speed. Propelled by sails or oars, because of its smaller size, a cutter could also serve as a ship's boat, and it was used for communication between ships or as a messenger. The fledgling country lacked the financial resources to pay annual tribute to the Barbary States, which made their ships susceptible to capture after 1785. The Barbary Coast was the name given to coastal regions of central and western North Africa, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, as well as the Sultanate of Morocco. In 1789, the newly ratified Constitution empowered Congress to establish a navy in Article 1, Section 8. But during George Washington's first term, 1787 to 1793, minimal efforts were made. On the other side of the ocean, Portugal had blockaded the Strait of Gibraltar that confined the Barbary pirates to the Mediterranean until 1793. The blockade was removed, the pirates entered the Atlantic, and almost immediately they captured 11 American merchant ships and more than 100 seamen. In response to these seizures, Congress passed the Naval Act of 1794. This approved construction of 6 frigates: the USS United States, President, Constellation, Chesapeake, Congress, and Constitution. Congress also allocated $800,000 for a treaty with the Algerians and to ransom captives. This led to an amendment that halted ship construction if peace was declared. They were still trying to avoid establishing a full navy. Ultimately, 3 frigates were completed: the USS United States, Constitution, and Constellation. Threats from the Barbary States persisted, and the Tripolitans declared war on the United States in May 1801 by chopping down the flag at the American embassy. This was the start of the First Barbary War. The 1,240-ton, 36-gun frigate USS Philadelphia was captured by the Moors, but later burned in a raid led by Stephen Decatur. When the Marines invaded the shores of Tripoli in 1805 and captured Derna, it marked the first time a U.S. flag flew over foreign land. After peace treaties were signed, the Navy was again reduced for economic reasons. President Jefferson and the Democratic-Republican Party opposed a strong navy. They favored small gunboats stationed in major Atlantic harbors. These lightly armed revenue cutters, proposed by Alexander Hamilton in Federalist Papers No. 11 and 12, were effective for about 10 years, but they proved inadequate as a wartime naval force for the new United States. The War of 1812 was going to be largely maritime. Shortly after the declaration of war against England, the modest U.S. Navy was engaged with an adversary that outnumbered it in ships 50-1. But within 2 months, the USS Constitution successfully defeated the HMS Guerriere. Subsequently, on October 25, 1812, the United States captured the HMS Macedonian and incorporated it into American service. You will hear a lot more about this venture in the section about Commodore Isaac Hull. He's buried at Laurel Hill East. In the summer of 1814, the British engaged in amphibious assaults on Washington and Baltimore. The capital surrendered to the British with minimal resistance, which led to the destruction of several American warships in the Washington Navy Yard, including the 44-gun frigate USS Columbia. At Baltimore, it was the bombardment of Fort McHenry that inspired Francis Scott Key to compose the Star-Spangled Banner. After the war, increased funding did allow the Navy to build some new ships, but many remained incomplete due to high costs. By the 1840s, the Navy started to use steam power and shell guns rather than cannons, but it still lagged behind the French and British advancements in those technologies. Pirates of the Caribbean presented a significant challenge between 1815 and 1822, during which approximately 3,000 ships were captured. That's about 1 per day. In 1819, Congress authorized President Madison to address this issue, but the piracy persisted until a military campaign led by the West India Squadron under the command of David Porter effectively countered these threats. It was during this campaign that the USS Seagull became the first steam-powered vessel to engage in combat action. The Navy played a crucial role in the Mexican-American War, 1845 to 1848. During the Battle of Vera Cruz, the Atlantic Squadron transported 12,000 troops and equipment, which led to the capture of Mexico City and the end of the war. The Pacific Squadron had also helped capture California. The segment about David Connor will cover the Battle of Vera Cruz. The Africa Squadron, formed in 1820 to combat the slave trade, was unpopular politically and withdrawn in 1823. But it returned in 1842 under the Webster-Ashburton Treaty with Britain. Between 1845 and 1850, the U.S. Navy captured only 10 slave vessels, compared to 423 captured by the British, who freed 27,000 captives. One of these captures is discussed in the podcast section about Sylvanus Godon. Congress authorized the United States Military Academy in 1802, but it took nearly 50 years to approve a similar school for the Navy. Secretary of the Navy George Bancroft bypassed Congress to create a naval academy. He formed a council led by Commodore Matthew Perry and transformed Fort Severn at Annapolis into the United States Naval Academy in 1845. It wasn't officially designated by Congress until 1851. The Naval Academy started in October 1845 with 56 midshipmen and 7 professors. By the end of 1861, 373 officers had left the United States Navy to join the Confederacy. On April 20th, 1861, the Union burned its ships at the Norfolk Navy Yard to avoid Confederate capture. One of the burnt hulls was used by the Confederate engineers to convert the USS Merrimack into the CSS Virginia, which battled the Monitor to a draw at the Battle of Hampton Roads. During the Civil War, the Confederacy introduced new naval technologies. In addition to the ironclad ships, they developed underwater mines, which were called torpedoes because of their resemblance to the torpedo electric eel. Submarine warfare also emerged during this period. At the Battle of Mobile Bay, Admiral David Farragut ordered his fleet to advance, but one of the lead vessels, the USS Tecumseh, struck a mine and sank. The fleet hesitated. From his position atop the main mast of his flagship, the USS Hartford, Admiral Farragut used a trumpet to inquire about the situation. When he learned about the torpedoes, he famously declared, "Damn the torpedoes! 4 bells, Captain Drayton, go ahead. Jouet, full speed." Captain Percival Drayton is interred at Laurel Hill East, and his contributions will be further discussed in future content that covers the Navy during the American Civil War, along with Charles Ellett, an Army man who died as a result of a wound that he received at the Battle of Memphis, and some other Civil War sailors. I will get around to that eventually, I hope. The blockades in the Civil War were successful, and along with the failing railroads, the loss of rivers, foraging by both armies caused the Southern economy to collapse. Food shortages led to inflation. This led to distrust in the currency. By 1864, food distribution broke down, riots broke out in the South, and the Union's victory at Fort Fisher in January 1865 closed the last Southern port. That ended blockade running and essentially ended the war. Following the Civil War, the Navy again experienced a significant period of decline. In 1864, there had been more than 51,500 personnel in the U.S. Navy, and they were sailing nearly 700 vessels, along with 60 Monitor-type coastal ironclads. This made it the second largest naval force globally after the Royal Navy. 15 years later, the Navy's active fleet had been reduced to 48 ships and 6,000 personnel. Both the vessels and the shore facilities were deteriorating. For a brief period, in 1869, Laurel Hill East resident Adolph Edward Bory served as Secretary of the Navy under his friend Ulysses S. Grant. He controversially renamed many naval ships, but he enforced full pay for an 8-hour workday, and he desegregated the Washington Navy Yard before he stepped down. He claimed poor health, but he lived for another 11 years. By 1881, when Garfield's administration took office, the Navy was even in worse shape. A review for Secretary of Navy William H. Hunt found only 52 of 140 vessels operational, with just 17 iron-hulled ships, including 14 old Civil War ironclads. Without wars, naval ships focused on exploration, such as seeking the Northwest Passage. The USS Jeannette expedition, 1879 to 1881, included Civil War veteran George Melville, who later became the Navy's chief engineer. Melville is the subject of another part of this podcast, along with the USS Jeannette expedition. Now, I was an Army guy. I served in the Army. I know Army rankings very well. Naval rankings I still stumble over because they don't quite line up with the Army. Let me share with you. Second lieutenant in the Army is an ensign or a midshipman. That's the lowest level of an officer. First lieutenant in the Army is a lieutenant junior grade, lieutenant JG, or sub-lieutenant in the Navy, sub-LT. Now here's where it really gets confusing. A captain in the Army is a lieutenant in the Navy. A major in the Army is a lieutenant commander in the Navy. A lieutenant colonel in the Army is a commander in the Navy. And a colonel in the Army is a captain in the Navy. Now, it gets a little easier once you get to the flag officers. Brigadier general is a commodore, major general, rear admiral, lieutenant general is a vice admiral, and a four-star general is a four-star admiral. The naval fleet is equivalent to an army, and a flotilla is a homogeneous group of the same type of warship. Got it? All right, let's get started. The script was written by fellow tour guide Russ Dodge, but he declined the opportunity to narrate it. Isaac Hull and Old Ironsides. When the young United States declared war on the Empire of Great Britain in June 1812 over long-standing tensions between the two nations, all parties involved and global observers knew that the nascent American nation would have to take on the world's most powerful and extensive navy if there was any hope to bring the conflict to victory. The United States Navy had gained experience in naval victories in the 1798 quasi-war with France and the Barbary Wars of 1801 to 1803, but was still considered an upstart force that would be easily brushed aside by the British capital ships. The Americans had a number of experienced sea captains and had taken time after much debate to build a small number of powerful warships, but neither were considered nearly enough to go ship to ship with the vaunted British Navy. Quick victories would be needed to inspire a nation suddenly at war and to send message to America's enemy that the United States Navy was a force to be reckoned with. Such a victory would come only 2 months after the declaration of war, and the architect of that victory would be Laurel Hill resident Commodore Isaac Hull, buried in Section G of Laurel Hill East. Isaac Hull was born March 9th, 1773 in Connecticut. Most accounts place his birth in the town of Derby in New Haven County, and that town fets him a native son to this day. Other accounts, though, place his birth at nearby Shelton, which was then called Henderson, in Fairfield County. He was born into a seafaring family on the eve of the Revolutionary War, with his father, Joseph, being a fourth-generation merchant sea captain. When the war began, the elder Hull joined the Continental Army as an artilleryman, and later was the commander of a small flotilla of ships patrolling the Long Island Sound, while occasionally engaging in commercial whaling. Young Isaac joined his father on one of the whaling expeditions and received his first lessons in seamanship. This inspired his love of the sea that mirrored the Hulls that had gone before him. Isaac Hull would also learn the sea trade at his young age, sailing on ships in the Housatonic River. The elder Hull was captured by the British and suffered greatly on one of the infamous British prison ships. As his father's health was damaged by his time as a prisoner of war, Isaac Hull was sent in 1784 to live with his uncle William Hull, who would go on himself to win infamy in the future War of 1812. The desire was for young Isaac to receive an education and eventually earn a collegiate degree. But it was obvious that the boy had been enthralled by the sea. Rather than be tethered to a classroom, at age 14 he joined a ship's crew as a cabin boy. From 1784 to 1793 he plied his trade as he sailed with ships along the eastern seaboard and would join merchant voyages to the West Indies with his father, who had resumed his seafaring life. His skills grew so impressive that in 1793, at age 20, Hull was given command of his own merchant brig. For the next 5 years, he would learn to handle commanding men, ship supplies, and cargo, invaluable skills which would help him at the time of national crisis. The Continental Navy had been established in October of 1775, but it was disbanded after the United States gained its independence. However, as the new nation struggled to build revenue and to pay their financial debts, its shipping, the lifeblood of its economy, had been under near constant threat from smuggling operations, restrictions from Great Britain and France, who did not want another rival for their goods, and from ships' seizures and crippling tributes forced by the Barbary states on the north coast of Africa. That brought about the reestablishment of the United States Navy in 1794 and the building of 6 powerful frigates. One was the now legendary USS Constitution. The new Navy needed experienced officers, and men like Isaac Hull were in great demand. On March 9th, 1798, his 25th birthday, Isaac Hull was commissioned as a lieutenant in the United States Navy. He would spend the next 43 years in the service. His first assignment was on the USS Constitution. He served under Commodore Silas Talbot as his executive officer. Commodore Talbot was also the commander of the squadron that included the Constitution, which often left Isaac Hull the de facto commander of the ship. A hero of the Revolution, Silas Talbot was greatly admired by Hull, and his influence on the young officer would shape his later career more than any other officer. Talbot also leaned heavily on Lieutenant Hull in May 1800, when the Constitution first captured the American smuggler ship Sally. Then, the 6-gun French letter of marque privateer ship Sandwich off Santo Domingo, today's Dominican Republic. Isaac Hull had used the just-captured ship Sally to make a surprise boarding of the French privateer and secured it without any casualties. Naval historian Edgar Stanton Maclay would later write, "This gallant affair was conducted with much steadiness and reflects the highest credit on Lieutenant Hull, but the seizure was illegal, as Captain Talbot learned on arrival in port, and the Sandwich was returned with full compensation for losses." When Talbot resigned his Navy commission in September 1801, Isaac Hull was given formal command of the USS Constitution, a ship he and his legacy would both be indelibly tied to in his lifetime and in the present day. His first tenure as commander of the Constitution lasted until April 1802, when he was assigned as the lieutenant of the frigate USS Adams, with whom he sailed to the Mediterranean Sea as part of the first United States force to confront the North African Barbary states in what has become known as the Barbary Wars. Since the United States achieved independence, trade to land around the Mediterranean Sea had been hampered by the ongoing piracy acts of the states of Tunis, Tripoli, Algiers, now present-day Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria, and Morocco. American ships were captured and held for ransom. Their crews were often kidnapped and enslaved by the Barbary pashas. Large and sometimes crushing tribute money was demanded by the states to ensure safe passage of American vessels. Up to the 1800s, it was considered more cost-effective to pay the ransoms and tributes rather than mount a military expedition to end the practice. But by 1801, President Thomas Jefferson, many members of Congress, and much of the American public came to believe the situation and the humiliating blows to American prestige were intolerable. A series of naval expeditions were sent to the region by the United States to end the Barbary states' hold over American shipping. Lieutenant Isaac Hull was part of those expeditions, and during the operations he received a chance to show his military seafaring acumen. The USS Adams, Captain Hugh G. Campbell in command, was Isaac Hull's first ship in the Barbary Wars. As part of Commodore Richard V. Morris' squad, the Adams took part in blockading Tripolitan ships and attempting to intimidate the Barbary pashas. However, Commodore Morris proved to be an indecisive and ineffectual commander, and the squadron was recalled without producing any tangible results. Lieutenant Hull would return on the next expedition in command of the schooner USS Enterprise, arriving in the Mediterranean in 1802. In early 1803, Isaac Hull and his ship captured a raiding Tunisian vessel and later participated on bombarding Tripoli shore batteries. Through the year, the Enterprise and its crew would seek to confront the many small enemy ships along the coast, often sending shore parties to burn them before they could take to the sea. On November 3, 1803, Isaac Hull was detailed to exchange ship commands with Captain Stephen Decatur, who took command of the Enterprise, while Lieutenant Hull of the brig USS Argus. With the Argus, Isaac Hull would participate in the decisive action of the conflict with the Barbary States. Throughout most of 1804, the Argus spent its time blockading Tripoli and occasionally chased the swift blockade runners. In August, it participated in bombarding shore batteries, repeating what Isaac Hull and the Enterprise had done a year earlier, and conducting a reconnaissance of Tripoli's harbor while under fire. In early September, Lieutenant Hull and the Argus escorted the fire ship USS Intrepid in a nighttime operation against Tripoli. The Intrepid was laden with explosives, and the plan was to blow it up among the Tripolitan corsair ships along the harbor walls. The plan was discovered, and the Intrepid blew up prematurely before it could get into position. The Argus was detailed to pick up survivors, but none were found. It was realized that all on board had been killed. The so-called floating volcano took 13 sailors down with it. In April 1805, Isaac Hull and the Argus played a critical role in the capture of the Tripolitan city of Derna. The former United States consul to Tunis, William Eaton, had cobbled together in Egypt a force of 500 to 600 Arabian mercenaries, led by 10 U.S. Marines, for the purpose of deposing Pasha Yusuf Karamanlim and returning his brother Hamet Karamanlim, the actual rightful heir to the Tripolitan throne, to the seat of Tripoli's ruling government. In exchange, Hamet would grant the United States favorable trade status, ending the tributes and the ransoms. Eaton's force marched over 500 miles across the North African desert to Derna. 2 days before they reached the city, the force met the squadron containing the Argus, and Isaac Hull assisted in providing supplies for the force and money to pay the mercenaries. On April 26, 1805, Eaton launched his assault on the city. Hull and the Argus fired on the city's fortifications, which returned fire. An hour later, Derna's defenses were silenced by the Argus and other ships of the squadron. Later in the battle, the Argus's guns helped beat back a counterattack, which allowed Eaton's forces to capture the city. The American flag was planted by United States Marine Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon on the fortifications where the Tripolitan batteries had been silenced by the Argus, a scene that is immortalized in the Marine Corps hymn by the line, "To the Shores of Tripoli." The capture of the city of Derna effectively ended the Barbary Wars with a victory for the United States in its first conflict on foreign seas and soil. Isaac Hull was later praised for his performance by both William Eaton and Squadron Commander Commodore Edward Preble. During his service off the Barbary coast, Isaac Hull had been promoted to Master Commandant on May 19, 1804. 2 years later, April 23, 1806, he was promoted to captain. In the years between the end of the Barbary Wars and the beginning of the War of 1812, the British became the undisputed masters of the sea. They had crushed their biggest rival to the claim, France, in the Battle of Trafalgar in October 1805. This gave rise to tensions between the British Empire and the still young United States. Emboldened by their powerful navy that had no rivals, the British began a near decade of intimidation and depredations against American shipping and navy. British impressment of sailors on American vessels into the British Navy caused the most tension, as it repeatedly flouted of American sovereignty, as well as being the most obvious display of British disdain for the United States. During these years, Captain Hull would oversee the construction of gunboats, and he commanded a succession of warships. He gained the reputation of a skilled and competent naval officer who took pains to treat his sailors fairly in a time when sea service and disciplinary measures were often extremely harsh. On his ships, he abolished flogging as a punishment for minor offenses, leaving it in place only for major crimes. He endeavored to keep his ships well supplied and drilled, and he trained his crews incessantly to have them better prepared for any conflict. Among naval circles, he earned a stellar reputation as one of the best all-round seamen in the fleet. Between 1809 and 1810, he would command first the USS Chesapeake, then the USS President, and then be back in command of the USS Constitution. When he received command of the Chesapeake in February of 1809, he was commander for 7 months before he transferred his command to the President in May of 1809. His tenure as the commandant there would last only 2 months, as Commodore John Rogers, senior to Captain Hull, preferred that to his previous command, the Constitution. The Constitution had been at sea for 7 years. It had been worn down by the hard service. Commodore Rogers claimed as senior naval officer in the Navy he deserved the President, the much fitter ship. Captain Hull knew all too well the capabilities of the Constitution once it received repairs and refitting, and he was happy to acquiesce to the swapping of commands. On June 17, 1809, the command exchange took place, and Isaac Hull was back on his favorite ship. Together, they would make naval history in the upcoming war with Great Britain. Between 1811 and 1812, the Constitution made a cruise around Europe, visiting various ports, attempting to spread American goodwill, and showing off one of the most powerful ships in the American fleet. Hull oversaw the training and education of the ship's young officers, and the training and drilling of his crew, especially in sails and gunnery, training that would prove to produce great dividends. The Constitution was recalled just in time for the outbreak of war between Great Britain and the United States. The tightened restrictions and continued impressment of American sailors finally came to a head when the United States declared war on the British Empire on June 18, 1812. What became known as the War of 1812 had begun, and the United States found themselves again at war with the British 29 years after they gained their independence from them. July 12, 1812, Captain Hull set the Constitution to sea. He hoped to join the squadron that Commodore Rogers was leading with the USS President. On July 17th, off the shore of Egg Harbor, New Jersey, he came upon 5 ships, which he initially thought was the command of Commodore Rogers. However, he soon discovered it was a British blockading squadron under Captain Philip Broke, which had sailed out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, once word came of the declaration of war. This squadron consisted of the HMS Aeolus, Africa, Belvidera, Guerriere, and Shannon, all rated from 38 to 64 guns. Such firepower could overwhelm the Constitution if they caught it. Captain Hull was determined to avoid that prospect, and when the British ascertained that the ship they saw was American, they made their pursuit. What followed next was one of the most remarkable chases in naval history. Well, the situation started off fearfully. The waters and winds were dead calm, and the Constitution had no prospects of making headway in its flight from the British. One of Isaac Hull's junior officers suggested they try the tactic of kedging, and Captain Hull readily concurred. Kedge anchors were shorter and slightly lighter secondary anchors, often used to limit the sway the ship would make while it is anchored, particularly at a river or at a dock. It is also used to help ships that have run aground to remove themselves from land. In the Constitution's case, in July 1812, the kedge anchors were rowed ahead of the ship in smaller boats dropped to the seafloor, then winched back, dragging the ship along with it. With this, the Constitution moved ahead of the British ships until they too used it to combat the dead calm and move themselves along. Captain Hull also wetted down his sails so they could fully utilize any breeze that came about. For the next 2.5 days, the Constitution used these and other tactics to stay ahead of the British, and even resorted to dumping most of their drinking water to lighten their load. Whenever the British got close, they fired their cannons at the American ship, with the HMS Belvidera firing a full broadside at one point. All of the cannonballs fell short. The final tactic that threw off the British pursuers for good was when a relatively small squall came upon the Constitution, and Captain Hull ordered the ship prepared to make it look like the Constitution was about to enter a heavy storm. The British took notice, and they held off, believing that a dangerous squall was coming. This finally allowed the Constitution to put enough distance between it and the British. After firing 2 shots at the American ship, Captain Broke ended the pursuit. For nearly 60 hours, Captain Hull had guided his ship through an intense chase against a powerful and determined foe, and he saved his crew and his ship, the loss of which would have been a heavy blow to the United States in a war that was barely a month old. When they reached Boston, Massachusetts, Captain Hull and his crew were given a grand reception for their feat, and newspapers across the United States carried the news of their remarkable escape. Even the British paid tribute to Captain Hull's seamanship and skill, although much of the British press were unimpressed. One newspaper wrote that the USS Constitution was, quote, a bundle of pine boards sailing under a bit of striped bunting, that a few broadsides from England's wooden hulls would drive the paltry striped bunting from the ocean. Many did not like seeing the nascent American Navy gain any sort of victory over the mighty British fleet. Isaac Hull and the Constitution would give them much more consternation only a month later. Fearing that the Navy Department would act timidly in the face of British squadrons off the United States coast, Captain Hull sailed with the Constitution on August 2, 1812, without orders yet to do so. His fears were well-founded. Only days later, a letter from the Navy Secretary arrived that ordered him to remain in Boston until further notice. That placed an additional burden on the intrepid Captain Hull. Had the Constitution been captured or sunk, Isaac Hull would have faced a court-martial and possible execution. As it turned out, that was one result he need not have feared. He sailed to the seas around Nova Scotia. The Constitution captured and burned several small British merchant brigs and wreaked havoc on British shipping in the area. On August 19th, Captain Hull discovered a much bigger prize. A British warship was spotted. It was determined to be the HMS Guerriere, which had been part of the group that chased the Constitution back in July. The Guerriere, commanded by Captain James Dacres, cleared its decks for battle, as did Isaac Hull with his vessel. Even though the British ship was rated 38 guns to the Constitution's 44, Captain Dacres went into the engagement full of confidence that as part of the unbeatable British Navy they had nothing to fear from the Americans. Captain Dacres fired first, intent on destroying the Americans at long range, a tactic which failed due to the general inaccuracy of British gunners. After a few desultory shots back at the Guerriere, Isaac Hull held his return fire, even though his well-trained gun crews itched to give back to the British. British cannonballs were bouncing off the Constitution's thick, heavy oak boards, which reportedly made an American sailor to yell, "Huzza, her sides are made of iron," thus giving the ship its nickname, Old Ironsides. Captain Hull then ordered his ship to set extra sails, which helped the American ship close in faster than expected to the British vessel. He waited until the two ships were in pistol shot of each other before he ordered the guns to open fire. For the next 15 minutes, the Constitution and Guerriere fired at each other at close quarters. Owing to its larger complement of guns and better trained gun crews, the Constitution inflicted far more damage than it received. The Guerriere's mizzenmast came down. This hampered its ability to maneuver. Hull took advantage of this and crossed ahead of the British ship, raking her with a broadside. The two ships' rigging became entangled, and both Captain Hull and Captain Dacres ordered boarding parties. Rifle fire erupted. Several United States Marines were killed or wounded, and Captain Dacres received a wound himself. The ships pulled away from each other before the boarding parties could cross over, and the Guerriere's foremast and mainmast snapped and fell overboard. This left it helpless to maneuver. The Constitution repaired some of its damage and then went to renew the battle when Captain Dacres ordered a shot in the direction away from the Constitution. A second boarding party was sent to the British ship, which Captain Dacres then surrendered. When he greeted Captain Hull, Captain Dacres offered his sword, which Isaac Hull returned, stating he cannot take it from someone who fought so gallantly. The Guerriere had been pounded into a wreck, and Captain Isaac Hull achieved the very first victory of an American capital ship over a British ship of the line. After he returned to port with his prisoners, the news of the Constitution's victory electrified the nation. Captain Hull became an instant national hero. He was feted with an even grander banquet by Boston. Several state legislatures passed resolutions of thanks to him and presented him a sword of honor. His visage adorned banners, plateware, commemorative items. United States Congress awarded him a gold medal, and $50,000 in prize money was given to be divided among the officers and crew. In terms of the war, the battle was inconsequential. The British Navy could afford to lose a capital ship. But the battle served notice to the British and to the world that the small American Navy that was considered an upstart could go toe-to-toe with Britain's best, and it would forever be a dangerous foe. The remarkable 2 months Isaac Hull spent at sea would be the only time he would hold a sea command during the War of 1812. At his own request, he was assigned to become the commander of the Portsmouth Navy Yard in Kittery, Maine. During the next 3 years, the newly minted national hero would oversee the construction and outfitting of a number of ships, enacting improvements that were adopted by other Navy yards and bolstering the yard's defenses. When the Constitution would go on to claim even more victories under different officers, Isaac Hull was content to do the rest of his part for the war on land. After the War of 1812 ended in what was essentially a draw, Isaac Hull spent several years on the Navy Board of Commissioners and was given the courtesy rank of Commodore. The board was empowered to oversee the procurement of goods and supplies, oversee construction of naval ships, and have oversight of the various Navy yards and Navy stations and dry docks. The now Commodore Hull had a large hand in making or suggesting improvements, and he pointed out wasteful spending and graft. Some decisions caused controversy, such as recommendations that a number of Navy yards be closed. He later himself commanded first the Charleston Navy Yard in Boston, then the Washington Navy Yard. In between those two assignments, he returned to sea duty for the first time in 11 years as commander of the Pacific Squadron, which he led from 1823 to 1827. After his term as commander of the Washington Yard and a year of leave, he returned once more to sea duty as commander of the European Squadron from 1839 to 1841. He then retired after serving continually since 1798, and he made his home in Philadelphia, where he died at age 69 on February 13th, 1843. The old national hero was given an elaborate military funeral, which was held at the Christ Episcopal Church on 2nd Street. By orders of the Navy Department, flags were flown at half-mast, and the bell over the Pennsylvania State House, which we now know as Independence Hall, was tolled as the funeral procession made its way from his residence to the church. His remains were interred in a temporary vault until spring came, And then he was interred at Laurel Hill Cemetery East on May 4, 1843 in Section G, Lot 241. His grave was marked by a monument modeled after the sarcophagus of the Roman general Scipio Barbatus and was topped by a sculpted American eagle. The original columns that surrounded the grave deteriorated and fell decades ago, but have been replaced recently with replicas by Laurel Hill. Commodore Hull's most favorite ship, the USS Constitution, can be seen today in Boston Harbor as the oldest active commissioned United States Navy ship, and the only United States ship still afloat that sunk an enemy ship in battle. Again, this was written by fellow tour guide Russ Dodge. He did a fantastic job on it. Thanks, Russ. That was a great story. David Randolph Connor, 1792-1856, the Battle of Vera Cruz. Amphibious assaults have been conducted since the 16th century. The use of boats to land military troops was first developed in 1537, when Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain Charles V trained and assigned units to the Royal Armada specifically to fight on and from ships. The first amphibious landing conducted by what would become the United States Marine Corps was in 1776, when Samuel Nichols and his Continental Marines, predecessors of the United States Marine Corps, achieved a successful landing during the Raid of Nassau in the Bahamas as they were seeking to boost their supply of gunpowder. In the 20th century, U.S. military forces executed several successful amphibious assaults, such as the Incheon landing during the Korean War, the invasion of the Philippines. Remember that classic photograph of MacArthur wading to the shore. The Battle of Okinawa was another amphibious landing. But the biggest, by far the biggest amphibious operation in the history of warfare was Operation Overlord, better known as D-Day. It occurred June 6, 1944, with fighters from more than a dozen countries. The statistics related to D-Day are staggering. The Allies used more than 5,000 ships and landing craft to deploy more than 150,000 troops and 50,000 vehicles, from motorcycles to tanks. They took them across the English Channel to land at 5 beaches in Normandy, France. This collaborative operation involved not only American forces, but also British and Canadian troops, along with personnel from Australia, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, the Netherlands, France, Greece, New Zealand, Norway, Rhodesia, and Polish naval, air, and ground support. Historian Stephen Ambrose, in his book D-Day, June 6, 1944, stated that the movement of troops and equipment across the English Channel was akin to relocating the populations, vehicles, and supplies of the cities of Racine, Kenosha, and Green Bay, Wisconsin, across Lake Michigan overnight. The most significant amphibious landing of the 19th century was the United States Navy's operation to transport Army troops and Marines to capture the Mexican port of Vera Cruz in March 1847. The Army, led by General Winfield Scott, coordinated with the naval forces under the command of Commodore David R. Connor of Philadelphia, who is buried at Laurel Hill East. The Mexican-American War was one of many conflicts brought on because of the philosophy of manifest destiny, the 19th century belief in the United States that American settlers were destined to expand westward across North America. The expansion was considered both obvious, manifest, and certain destiny. This belief is rooted in concepts such as American exceptionalism, romantic nationalism, and racial nationalism. It suggested the inevitable spread of republicanism in the American way of life, and it represents an early form of American imperialism. Many Americans believed because of their natural superiority, it was their right and duty to spread democracy and civilization by force if necessary. Prior to the war, Mexico encompassed areas that would later become Texas, New Mexico, and California. But the Republic of Texas declared its independence from Mexico in 1836, only to be annexed by the United States in 1845. Mexico perceived this annexation as an act of aggression. They continued to regard Texas as part of their territory. There were also conflicting allegations about the southern boundary of Texas. The United States asserted that the Rio Grande was the border. Mexico maintained that it was Nueces River, which was located about 140 miles to the north. President James K. Polk, elected in 1844, was a strong believer in western expansion and aimed to acquire additional territories to achieve the objectives of Manifest Destiny. In early 1846, Polk deployed troops to the disputed territory, which only increased tensions and led to a Mexican military response. The United States pursued economic interests in the acquisition of California and New Mexico, regions abundant in resources and of strategic significance. If the United States secured control over these territories, it would enable trade and access to the Pacific Ocean and thereby foster economic development. There was considerable resistance from anti-slavery proponents who were concerned that territorial expansion would propagate slavery into new regions, thereby further exacerbating sectional conflicts. Mexico was also undergoing much political instability and internal strife. This hindered its capacity to respond effectively to the U.S. actions. The recurrent revolts and power struggles within Mexico undermined its ability to assert its claim in the face of U.S. expansion. One of the consequences of the Mexican-American War was the emergence of the United States as the dominant power on the North American continent. Many residents of Laurel Hill East were involved in this 2-year battle. Marine Major Levi Twiggs was killed at the Halls of Montezuma, the Battle of Chapultepec, just weeks after his son, George Decatur Twiggs, had also been killed in action. Army General Robert Patterson was commissioned as a Major General of Volunteers. He was given command of the 2nd Division of the Army of Occupation. Army General Percifor Smith commanded a brigade in Zachary Taylor's forces during the Battle of Monterey. Future leader of the Army of the Potomac, George Meade, was there, as was future Confederate General John Pemberton. Navy man, future Admiral Elie Augustus Frederick Lavalette, played a key role in the capture of Mazatlan. All of these men are buried at Laurel Hill East, which means I will probably have to do a Mexican-American War podcast eventually. The Mexican-American War was mainly land battles. There was no significant naval engagement, primarily because the United States Navy controlled the sea unchallenged, which made movement in support of American troops much easier. The Navy implemented a blockade along the Gulf Coast of Mexico to disrupt supply lines and reduce Mexican economic resources. Important ports like Vera Cruz and Tampico were targeted to restrict Mexican trade and military resupply operations. This blockade substantially affected Mexico's capacity to continue its war efforts. The Navy, led by Commodores John D. Sloat and Robert F. Stockton, secured key ports in California during the Pacific theater of the war. They captured Monterey, San Francisco, and other strategic locations. This ensured American control over California. The Navy provided essential support to Army forces on the Pacific coast by transporting troops and supplies, which were crucial for the advancement of their campaign. By securing sea lanes and ports, the Navy also safeguarded American maritime commerce from potential threats posed by Mexican privateers. This helped to maintain economic stability and bolster the war effort. And the United States Navy also conducted amphibious landings like the one at Vera Cruz. If the Army were to attack Mexico City from the north, the U.S. troops would need to march overland for hundreds of miles through desert, mountains, and jungle. This route was highly challenging due to the risk of dysentery, malaria, yellow fever, in addition to enemy actions. A route inland from Mexico's Gulf Coast would be shorter and more feasible. An expedition against the coastal city of Vera Cruz received significant consideration, especially after President Polk learned that a landing could be made from Isla Sacrificios, south of Vera Cruz, which allowed the city to be surrounded and bombarded into submission rather than stormed. While this plan was far more economical than the northern approach, a coastal landing would not result in an immediate and clear victory. They still had to establish a supply base and move the army more than 400 kilometers through swamps, jungles, and mountains. Scott felt that he would need 10,000 men, plus horses, artillery, and special landing craft to put them ashore. The operations would begin no later than January 1847, for even if a protracted siege had to take place before it surrendered, this would still leave time for a march inland before the yellow fever season began in May. Vera Cruz had been founded in 1560 by Hernan Cortez. Lobos Island, near the city, featured the fortress San Juan de Ulloa that was built shortly after the city's foundings. Winfield Scott noted that by 1847, San Juan de Ulloa had doubled its armaments since a siege a decade earlier, and that it had the capacity to sink the entire American Navy. In 1847, Vera Cruz's fortifications were among the strongest in the Western Hemisphere. San Juan de Ulloa's 135 guns were operated by 1,030 soldiers. The city was further protected by 9 small bastions with 3,360 soldiers and 86 guns, while the civilian population numbered 15,000. General Winfield Scott arrived in the Joint Operations Area on December 27, 1846. On January 3, 1847, he ordered most of Zachary Taylor's force, which had been serving in the Northern Theater, to the mouth of the Rio Grande River to await transport to Lobos Island. He also chartered 41 transport vessels to carry supplies, volunteers from Atlantic ports, ordnance, and specially built surf boats to land his army. By early March, Scott had assembled 12,000 fighters on Lobos Island off the coast of Vera Cruz. Although this assembly was easily observed by the Mexicans, they did not reinforce the troops in the city. While they were on Lobos Island, Scott organized his troops into 3 divisions. One division of regulars fell under the command of General William J. Worth. One division of regulars reported to General David E. Twiggs. That's the brother of Levi Twiggs, who's buried at Laurel Hill East. General David Twiggs later became a traitor and joined the Confederacy. The volunteer division answered to Laurel Hill's General Robert Patterson. On March 9, 1847, the United States Navy deployed 10,000 U.S. troops under General Scott's command at Colado Beach, approximately 3 miles south of Vera Cruz. The site was selected by Scott and Commodore David R. Connor, who was buried at Laurel Hill East in Section 14. This location was chosen because it was out of the range of Mexico's advanced artillery at the fortress of San Juan de Ulloa. The landing occurred without a single injury or fatality. After they took Vera Cruz, the 5-month march to Mexico City involved the Battle of Cerro Gordo in April of 1847, the occupation of Puebla in May, Battle of Contreras and Churubusco in August, Battle of Molino del Rey in September, the infamous Battle of Chapultepec, also known as the Halls of Montezuma, in September, and the capture of Mexico City the same month. When the war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, peace terms stipulated that, number 1, Mexico must sell its northern territories to the United States for U.S. $15 million. Mexico gave up 525,000 square miles of territory. 2. The United States would give full citizenship and voting rights and protect the property rights of Mexicans who lived in the ceded territories. And 3. The U.S. would assume the $3.25 million debt owed by Mexico to Americans. David Randolph Connor was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in 1792. After a series of unrewarding youthful jobs in Philadelphia, he joined the U.S. Navy early in 1809 and became a midshipman. He spent the next 2 years on the frigate USS President, a wooden-hulled, three-masted heavy frigate rated at 44 guns. She'd been launched in April of 1800 from a shipyard in New York City. The President was the last of the original 6 frigates authorized by the Naval Act of 1794 to be completed. Master shipbuilder Joshua Humphreys, who spent his entire life in the Philadelphia suburb of Ardmore, designed these frigates to be the young Navy's capital ships. Humphreys is buried in Delaware County. On the night of May 16, 1811, the USS President was involved in the Little Belt affair off the North Carolina coast. HMS Little Belt was a 6th-rate British sloop of war, originally the Danish ship Lillebelt, before it was captured by the British in the 1807 Battle of Copenhagen. Little Belt is a strait in Denmark. It's parallel to, but smaller than, Big Belt. The President mistakenly identified HMS Little Belt as the HMS Guerriere, which had recently impressed a soldier from an American brig. The ships exchanged cannon fire for several minutes. It caused 11 fatalities and 21 injuries on the British ship. The crew of the President remained largely unscathed. Subsequent investigations by both American and British authorities assigned blame to each other without reaching a resolution. But this incident contributed to the rising tensions between the United States and Britain that eventually led to the War of 1812 and the HMS Guerriere becoming an American capture. In 1811, Midshipman Connor joined the sloop of war USS Hornet, the third of 8 ships to bear that name. He stayed with this vessel throughout the War of 1812, except for a brief period when he was taken as a prisoner of war by the HBM Hazard. HBM stood for His British Majesty's Ship. Hornet's design was a compromise between the 6 original U.S. frigates and the coastal gunboats that had been championed by President Jefferson. The Hornet launched July 28, 1805 in Baltimore, and was commissioned there on October 18th with Master Commandant Isaac Chauncey in command. Connor served on the Hornet's chase of the HMS Belvidera and her sinking of the HMS Peacock, a cruiser-class big sloop armed with 2 6-pounders at the bow as chase guns and 16 32-pound carronades on a single deck. The HMS Cruiser was a 100-foot-long prototype with fore and aft sails. The British Navy eventually built 105 of them. On February 14, 1813, off eastern Guyana's coast, the Peacock and Hornet engaged, which left the Peacock with 17 dead and 33 wounded, while the Hornet had 5 dead, 3 of them drowned, and 4 wounded. March 23, 1815, the HMS Penguin, this is another cruiser-class brig sloop, encountered the USS Hornet off Tristan da Cunha. In the ensuing action, Penguin lost 10 men killed and had 28 wounded. She struck her colors after 22 minutes of combat. By contrast, the Americans only suffered 1 man killed and 9 wounded, but it included the Hornet's captain, James Biddle, not a Philadelphia Biddle, believe it or not, and Connor, who was severely wounded in the hip. It took him 2 years to recover from that wound before he could return to duty, but he carried that ball in him for the rest of his life. The Americans scuttled the Penguin the next day. She was too damaged to keep. Connor received 2 medals of valor from Congress and a sword from Pennsylvania for his bravery. The sword was presented at the Independence Hall. These items, the sword and the medals, along with a painting of the Hornet and the Penguin engagement, may sound familiar. If you've been to the Hill Physic Keith House on South 4th Street, they are in the Cincinnati Room. Connor's portrait by John Wesley Jarvis was created in 1813. That's also part of the collection. It accurately depicts him in his naval uniform. Why the Hill Physic Keith House? Well, in 1828, David Connor married Susan Dilwyn Physic, the daughter of famed surgeon Philip Singh Physic. They had 2 children, Philip Singh Physic Connor, 1837 to 1910, and Edward Emlyn Connor, 1840 to 1884. The older son worked hard to keep up his father's legacy. After the War of 1812, Lieutenant Connor served as first lieutenant aboard the USS Ontario under Captain Biddle when the United States took possession of Oregon in 1818. He also served in the Pacific and had shore duty in Philadelphia. On June 23, 1821, the USS Dolphin was launched by the Philadelphia shipyard and sent to New York City for sea preparations. Assigned to the Pacific Squadron, it sailed December 8, 1821, under Lieutenant David Connor's command, alongside the massive ship-of-the-line USS Franklin with its 86 32-pounders. The Dolphin arrived at Valparaiso, Chile, February 6, 1822, and it cruised the coasts of Ecuador, Peru, and Chile to protect American commerce and the whaling industry. Connor attained the rank of commander in March 1825. He was commanding officer of the sloops of war USS Erie and USS John Adams before he was promoted to captain in 1835. You're going to hear more about the USS Erie in the next section of the podcast. He served as Navy Commissioner in 1841 and 42 when the Bureau system was established in the Navy. He was the first chief of the Bureau of Construction, Equipment, and Repair. The Board of Navy Commissioners was the administrative body of 3 members that existed between 1815 and 1842. It had responsibility for the Navy's material support. Connor then served as commander of the Home Squad from 1845 to 1847. The Home Squad had been organized in the 1830s to protect coastal commerce, aid ships in distress, suppress piracy and the Atlantic slave trade, make coastal surveys, and train ships to relieve others on distant stations. It was a commander that Connor organized and executed the successful amphibious assault at Vera Cruz. Historians have noted the unusual Army-Navy cooperation that made this operation a success. If you dig deeper, you will find that during the War of 1812, when he was a young lieutenant, Winfield Scott was severely wounded at the Battle of Lundy's Lane near Niagara Falls. It was none other than Dr. Philip Singh Physic, Connor's father-in-law, who nursed Scott back to health. After the war, Connor left seagoing service when President Polk appointed him a special diplomatic agent to Mexico. He then commanded the Philadelphia Naval Yard, which then was located at Front and Federal. It didn't move to League Island until 1871. That was several years after Connor died. The Naval Yard, which closed in 1996, primarily outfitted, repaired, and overhauled warships. It only launched 70 Navy and Coast Guard ships over its 120-plus year history. It was mainly a home to the reserve fleet. Commodore David Connor died at Philadelphia on March 20th, 1856. He had served nearly 47 years in the U.S. Navy. His obituary in the tri-weekly Washington Sentinel laid the blame for his deterioration on the Naval Retirement Board, which had eased Connor out shortly before his medical decline and death. He was buried in the south section of Laurel Hill East. His papers are in the New York Public Library, and consists of almost 6 shelf feet, mostly correspondence. 2 destroyers of the United States Navy has been named in his honor. The USS Connor DD-72, a Caldwell-class destroyer, was in service from 1918 to 1940. And the USS Connor DD-582, a Fletcher-class destroyer, was in service from 1943 to 1946. In the 1959 comedy film Operation Petticoat, the Connor played the role of the American destroyer that attacks the USS Sea Tiger. The movie was set during the initial weeks of World War II. That's several months before the USS Connor was constructed. Connor's son, Philip Singh Physic Connor, wrote 3 brief monographs about his famous father: Commodore Connor, Home Squad Under Commodore Connor, and Castle of San Juan de Ulloa. All are available from archive.com at no charge. So what's coming up as far as tours at Laurel Hill? Here's one that really looks interesting. This is a new one. Tom Keels is doing this. It's called A Ghostly Gallery, Artists and Their Patrons. That is on Saturday, April 5th, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. at Laurel Hill East. And what does Tom say? He talks about young men and women struggle to make their marks. New millionaires were building their private art galleries. Tom is good at this stuff. I think you'll really enjoy that. Unfortunately, I have something else I have to do that day. So I'm not going to be able to. In fact, I'm giving a private tour that day, so I'm going to miss Tom's tour. That same day, Saturday, April 5th, in the morning, there's a members-only gathering with Peter Howell. It's called We're All Related, Finding a 19th Century Family. Peter has been researching his family at Laurel Hill for several years now. He's found more than 100 family members that he is connected to, people buried at Laurel Hill. He's going to talk about them and tell you what he found, tell you how you can do the same also. Sunday, April 6th, another new tour. Russ Dodge, the guy who did the script for Isaac Hull, is doing a brand new tour again. It's called April 1865, the month that changed America. You bet I'm going to be there for that. That is right in my wheelhouse. A couple of days later, there's a members-only Champion Tree lecture and tour. I assume that's at West, but let me double check. That's Tuesday, April 8th, from 5:30 to 7:30. Yeah, that's at West. Our Arboretum manager, Aaron Greenberg, will lead you around. That will leave from the conservatory. Thursday, April 10th, there's Sacred Spaces and Storied Places at Laurel Hill West. Pat Rose is going to be your guide for that. That's at 10 a.m. 10 a.m. on a weekday. Thursday, April 10th. 2 days later, on Saturday, April 12th, from 10 a.m. until noon, there's a Hotspots and Storied Plots tour. That means that is Laurel Hill East, and that'll be Jim Hentz taking you on that. The Big E, this one always sells out. Please get your tickets early. Saturday, April 12th, from 1 p.m. until 4 p.m. Unsinkable to unthinkable. We have 12 Titanic passengers who are represented at the 2 Laurel Hills, 6 at East and 6 at West. We'll be going to both cemeteries. That's why it's a 3-hour tour. But it is worth it. Laura Lewis just does such a great job on this. And like I say, this one always sells out. So please, please get your tickets early for that. The next day is another arborist tour. Beautiful Blooms, Spring Arbor Tour at Laurel Hill East from 1 p.m. until 3 p.m. The following Saturday, Liberty or Death, Revolutionary War Patriots. That is Saturday, April 19th from 1 p.m. until 3 p.m. I think that's Russ Dodge's tour. Let me see. Yeah, that's Russ's tour, so you know it's going to be a good one. There's a City Nature Challenge on Saturday, April 26th from 1 p.m. until 3 p.m. That is at Laurel Hill West. And that is an opportunity to observe and document plants and animals in the Green Burial Native Plant Garden, Nature's Sanctuary. Sacred Spaces and Storied Places, Saturday, April 26th, 10 a.m. at Laurel Hill West. Mary Ellen Moran is doing that one. And then another arborist tour, Beautiful Blooms, Spring Arbor Tour of Laurel Hill West, Sunday, April 27th from 1 p.m. until 3 p.m. I just hopped ahead to May, and the first movie is Friday, May 16th. Movie in the cemetery. It's Eraserhead. Ha! Put that on your calendar now. Sit on the hillside with 1,200 other people. I'm doing an accessible hotspots tour on Saturday, May 10th from 10 a.m. until 11:30 a.m. What that means is this is a tour that I designed specifically for people with ambulation or mobility difficulties. If you're in a scooter, if you're in a wheelchair, this is the tour you want to come on. It is totally on paved paths. There is one moderate hill and a couple of minor hills, but no steps. We do not go off into the grass, and it's truncated a little bit. We're going to do about an hour and a half. So keep that in mind. And then that afternoon, and it's not listed yet, but that afternoon, May 10th, Sarah Hamill and I are doing the sports tour at Laurel Hill West. That is a long one. I warn you in advance. You're going to make your steps that day because we pretty much cover the circumference of the cemetery to talk about the people who are the sports heroes of Laurel Hill West. I'll give you more details at the beginning of next month. Let's get back to the podcast. Sylvanus W. Godon, 1809-1879. The Hanging of Lucky Nat Gordon. On March 4th, 1861, the day that President Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated, the United States Navy had 8 ships deployed on anti-slavery patrol off the coast of West Africa. The sloops of war Constellation, Portsmouth, and Saratoga, the screw steamers San Jacinto, Mohican, Sumter, and Mystic, and the stores ship Relief. These vessels were armed with 95 guns, and they were manned by nearly 1,000 sailors. Of the 6 American naval squadrons at sea at that time, only the Home Squadron, which was made up of 12 ships, 187 guns, and approximately 2,000 personnel, was larger. A squadron is a group of warships that's considered too small to be designated a fleet. A fleet is usually commanded by a flag officer, such as a vice admiral or a rear admiral. Squadrons are sometimes commanded by commodores or the most senior captain. Nowadays, the term squadron has replaced flotilla to indicate a group of ships. Some of these ships were steam-powered. The U.S. Navy's first steam warship, the USS Princeton, was launched in 1843 from the Philadelphia Naval Yard with a screw propeller and advanced engineering. The next year, during a demonstration on the Potomac River, one of its guns exploded. That killed Secretary of State Abel P. Upshur, Secretary of the Navy Thomas Walker Gilmer, and 4 others. President John Tyler was aboard the ship, but he was unharmed below decks. In addition to the African Squadron and the Home Squadron, which was responsible for the waters along the eastern coast of the United States, from Maine down to Florida, the other 4 squadrons were 1. The Mediterranean Squadron, to protect American commerce and interests in Europe and North Africa, as well as to engage in diplomatic missions. 2. The Pacific Squadron, which covered the Pacific Ocean, particularly along the western coast of the United States and extending to the coasts of Central and even South America. Number 3, the Asiatic Squadron, This was focused on the waters of East Asia and the Western Pacific and was responsible for safeguarding American interests in China and Japan, as well as just maintaining a naval presence in the region. And fourth, the West Indies Squadron. This operated in the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico to protect American shipping and interests in the Caribbean and to conduct anti-piracy operations. In 1860, the entire United States Navy had about 90 commissioned vessels. This included a mix of steam and sailing ships. The fleet included 10 to 15 frigates, 30 to 40 sloops and other sailing ships, 25 to 30 steam-powered vessels, including both frigates and gunboats, and 10 to 15 small crafts such as tenders, survey ships, other auxiliary vessels. By 1860, the U.S. Navy had a structured hierarchy of several hundred officers. The number of men at each rank was limited by Congress, and people who had qualifications for promotion could often not reach the next level until somebody died or retired. There were about 8 to 10 commodores, 60 to 70 captains, 100 to 120 commanders, 300 to 400 lieutenants, 200 to 300 ensigns, and 5,000 to 6,000 enlisted sailors. The rank of admiral was not established by Congress until July 16, 1862. The USA has historically been connected to the pursuit of profit, and slave trade is one of the most profitable enterprises. In America, it began in 1619, when a Dutch ship sold 20 Africans to settlers in Jamestown. Among the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, which asserted the self-evident truths of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, 41 of those men had owned enslaved human beings at some point in their lives, and for many of them their fortunes were built on the backs of slave labor. Even the father of the American Navy, John Paul Jones, started his career on a slave ship. It is estimated that over a span of a few hundred years, somewhere between 12 million and 12.8 million of Africans were transported against their will across the Atlantic. Now, there was the first passage. This refers to the transport of Africans from their inland homes, where they were captured and sold, to the ports before they were loaded on ships. The final passage was the journey from the port of disembarkation in the Americas to the plantation or the other destination where they would be employed. The middle passage across the Atlantic connected these two stages. Now, the number of human beings that had been purchased by the traders was considerably higher than those who arrived on these shores, since the middle passage, which took anywhere from 1 to 6 months, had a mortality rate of about 20%. Between 1.2 and 2.4 million people died during the voyage. Millions more died in camps in the Caribbean after they arrived in the New World. Millions more died because of slave raids, wars, and during transport to the coast for sale to the European slave traders. The number of lives lost in the procurement of slaves will never be known, but may equal or even exceed the number who survived to be enslaved. Now, a typical slave ship had a crew of about 30. It carried hundreds of imprisoned humans. Usually they were shackled to each other. They were below the main deck on a cramped slave deck, about 4 feet tall. At best, they would be fed beans, corn, yams, rice, and palm oil, usually 1 meal a day with water. And with the beastly conditions in the hold of slave ships, diseases ran rampant, and an outbreak of smallpox or dysentery or measles could wipe out dozens of people. An enslaved human could be purchased in Africa for about $40 of trade goods, liquor, weapons, clothing, food. Once in the New World, the monetary value of enslaved Africans on any given American auction block ranged between $800 and $1,200. That's equivalent to somewhere between $32,000 and $48,000 per person. Thus, a cargo of 800 living slaves could fetch as much as $1 million on the auction block. Many enslavers held vast wealth. When Congress passed the Slave Trade Act of 1794, it prohibited making, loading, outfitting, equipping, or dispatching any ship for use in the slave trade. This restricted the activity to foreign ships. In the Slave Trade Act of 1800, Congress banned U.S. citizens from investing in the trade and from working on ships involved in the trade. Finally, March 1807, the House and Senate agreed on a bill called An Act to Prohibit the Importation of Slaves into any port or place within the jurisdiction of the United States from and after the first day of January in the year of our Lord 1808. President Thomas Jefferson, who owned more than 600 enslaved people during his lifetime, signed this bill into law the very day that it passed Congress. Why did it take so long? It's in the Constitution. Congress could not have banned the importation of persons before 1808 due to a clause in the Constitution from the 1787 Constitutional Convention. Article 1, Section 9. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. Many people believe this 1808 bill would finally end slavery in the South. Of course, they were wrong. In 1820, Congress raised the stakes again. They passed a law that made slave trading a capital offense. Any U.S. citizen on the crew of a foreign slave ship or anyone serving on a U.S. ship that seized a, quote, Negro or mulatto shall be adjudged a pirate and shall suffer death, end quote. These purportedly smart people had to use some sort of pretzel logic to determine that the barbaric methods to capture and transport black human beings were wrong, but that the same barbarism could be forgiven for the institute of slavery itself. In addition to the economic advantages of slave over paid labor, people use cultural superiority to justify subjugation of those deemed to be inferior. When laws declared slaves were property rather than human beings, they lost not only their rights, but their humanity. Certain interpretations of religious texts were used to justify slavery. And then, of course, there's the forever popular, but we've always done it that way. In 1807, England, which was then the world's largest slaving nation, prohibited its own slave trade. Additionally, they took measures to patrol the seas to intercept foreign ships and seize slaves destined for America. This action by England was not motivated by altruism, but rather as a business strategy to inhibit their commercial rivals, such as Spain, France, and Portugal, from accessing this labor market. Britain sent its ships after slavers with an almost religious zeal. Between 1842 and 1850, it seized more than 500 vessels and 38,000 captive Africans. During this same period, the United States African Squadron captured 7 ships. Historians attribute this discrepancy to many factors. For one thing, many of the secretaries of the Navy at this time were from Virginia or North Carolina. Numerous officers assigned to the Africa Squadron hailed from states where slavery was legally and socially accepted. For another thing, the Africa Squadron had set up its home base nearly 2,500 miles from the coast of Africa. It took them weeks just to get to the waters that they were supposed to patrol. Even when slave traders were captured, the conviction rate of sailors was low. From 1837 to 1861, 125 men accused of piracy and slave trading were prosecuted. 20 received prison sentences that averaged 2 years. 10 were pardoned by the president, and 3 pleaded to lesser charges. As expected, Southern courts were even less effective. No conviction related to slavery in Southern federal courts after 1846. It appeared that authorities were unwilling to execute anyone for slave trading, despite it being a capital offense. There was one and only one exception. In 1860, a door briefly opened and one man fell through. Captain Nathaniel Gordon of the ship Erie, a short, muscular, lifelong sailor from Portland, Maine, was captured off the coast of Africa by Captain Sylvanus William Godon of Philadelphia. Gordon's vessel was burdened by 897 black human beings that he had purchased in Africa and was bringing home for resale. Gordon had picked up the nickname Lucky Nat during his 3 previous trips to Africa and back. But after his trial in New York City, Lucky Nat Gordon was the only man executed by the United States government for the heinous crime of slave trading. Sylvanus Godon was Navy to the bone. He was born in Philadelphia in 1809 to a noted French mineralogist from Blois, France, who went insane and was institutionalized for the last few years of his life. Sylvanus joined the United States Navy in 1819 as a midshipman. That means he was 10 years old. He served at sea in various parts of the world and was promoted past midshipman in 1827. The rank of ensign was not established until 1862. A past midshipman, P-A-S-S-E-D, is a historical rank from the 19th century. It describes a midshipman who has passed the lieutenant's exam and is eligible for promotion to lieutenant as soon as there is a vacancy in that grade. Godon's lieutenancy did not come until 1836, when he was 27 years old. I find next to nothing about his family life. I cannot find where his father is buried or what happened to his mother. His sister Cecilia also had some mental health issues when she lived in France. She spent time in an asylum for hereditary folly. While she was hospitalized for 3 years, she met a man who called himself Baron de Martris, who was a spiritualist, and they married. I wish I could find more about that. I find nothing else about that branch of the family. But a woman with hereditary folly marrying a baron who is a spiritualist. Sylvanus Godon's early Navy career. He served under 2 people you've already heard about. From 1839 to 1841, he served on the USS Ohio as flag lieutenant or aide-de-camp to Commodore Isaac Hull of the Mediterranean Squadron. Godon was accused of insubordination by Hull, along with 4 other junior officers, and they were sent back to the Navy Department for judgment and reassignment. Godon was found guilty of disobedience of orders and neglect of duty, and sentenced to 2 years suspension from duty. But the conviction was overturned by the Secretary of the Navy, James Paulding. No one was punished. Godon served during the Mexican-American War. He commanded the bomb vessel USS Vesuvius at the siege of Vera Cruz under David Conner in 1847. Godon was promoted to commander on September 14, 1855. In 1860, Sylvanus Godon, in command of the steam-powered sloop of war USS Mohican, was assigned to the Africa Squadron. And on August 8, 1860, Lucky Nat Gordon's luck ran out when the sail-powered USS Erie was pursued and captured as it was leaving the mouth of the Congo River with his human cargo. Later that day, Commander Godon wrote to the Secretary of the Navy, Isaac Toucey, quote, I have the honor to inform the department that this morning at daylight I discovered a sail 30 miles at sea off the mouth of the Congo. Hauling up for her and finding I drew near without showing any flag, I fired a gun when she showed American colors. And on boarding her, she proved to be the ship Erie of New York with 997 slaves from the Congo. That number was actually 897. And a large number of persons on board claiming to be passengers, and indeed most of them were foreigners. As there was no acknowledged captain or mate and no ship's papers to be found, I could obtain no information that I could rely on. A clearance from Havana, dated 20th January 1860, named Nathaniel Godon as captain then. He says he sold the vessel up the Congo. He's now a passenger on board. I send him and 2 persons believed to be mates. This account does not fully explain the horrors that Godon and the Mohican found. Of the 897 humans captured, about half were children as young as 6 months old. The rest were evenly split between men and women. The oldest was about 40. In the intense heat of August, near the equator, the conditions can best be described as severely uncomfortable. All of the Africans were packed below deck, and the hatches were locked. They had been allowed no food or water since they boarded. As reported by the crew, their sufferings were really agonizing, and the stench from the hold was fearful. The Erie was now the Mohicans' prize. Godon selected a small prize crew from among the men and placed them on the Erie with instructions to sail to Monrovia, a voyage of 1,500 miles, to discharge their passengers into the newly formed Liberia, after which they were to proceed to New York, quote, and hand the vessel over to the judge of the U.S. District Court and surrender Godon and his 2 officers to the law. On the way to Liberia, which was a 2-week voyage, more than 30 more Africans died, and their bodies were thrown overboard. The United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, James I. Roosevelt, offered Godon a $2,000 fine and a 2-year sentence in exchange for information about his financial backers. Lucky Nat was confident he would not face any severe consequences, so he rejected the deal. After the Civil War started, the case was repeatedly delayed, and by the time that Godon went on trial, there was a new district attorney, Edward Delafield Smith. He decided to make an example out of Godon. Smith wanted Godon executed. There was a mistrial. Godon again came before a New York court, and on November 9th, 1861, he was found guilty of piracy by engaging in the slave trade. Godon received the death sentence mandated under the law. His execution was scheduled for February 7th, 1862. Nat was confined in the halls of justice in the House of Detention, which, due to its John Haviland-designed Egyptian revival styling, which resembled a mausoleum, had picked up a nickname. It was called the Tombs. Godon's supporters appealed to President Lincoln for a pardon. Lincoln was very well known among his contemporaries for his compassion. He issued many pardons during his presidency, but he refused to consider one for Godon. He refused to meet with Godon's supporters. Lincoln said, quote, "I believe I am kindly enough in nature and can be moved to pity and to pardon the perpetrator of almost the worst crime that the mind of man can conceive or the arm of man can execute. But any man who, for paltry gain and stimulated only by avarice, can rob Africa of her children to sell into interminable bondage, I will never pardon." He did, however, put a 2-week stay on the execution. Friends of Godon pleaded with Lincoln. There was still hope for a last-minute stay of execution, but fate declared otherwise. When Abraham Lincoln's favorite child, Willie, died of typhus on February 20th, the day before the scheduled hanging. Lincoln was prostrate with grief and completely unapproachable, and Nathaniel Lucky Nat Gordon's good fortune had come to an end. On the morning of February 21st, 1862, he attempted suicide. He ingested strychnine, which had been covertly provided by a friend during a visit. 3 physicians spent 4 hours administering interventions to save his life. They emptied his stomach. They catheterized him. I don't know why. They administered brandy and whiskey orally. And when he regained consciousness, Gordon exclaimed, "I've cheated you! I've cheated you!" He then begged the doctors to assist his suicide. He said he would rather die alone than suffer the humiliation of a public execution. He was sufficiently revived to be declared fit enough for execution. Gordon's last words, spoken to the executioner, were, "Make short work of it now, Bill. I'm ready." And thus Nat Gordon became the only American slaver to suffer judicial death as a consequence of his actions. He was 36 years old. He left behind a wife and a young son. He is buried in Brooklyn. Sylvanus Godon was promoted to captain effective July 16, 1862. He took part in the Battle of Port Royal under Admiral Samuel Francis DuPont. Although not part of DuPont's plan, he placed Mohican in position to secure an enfilading fire on Fort Walker on Hilton Head Island and materially assisted in silencing the batteries of the enemy. 1863, he was promoted to Commodore. He commanded the 4th Division of Admiral David Dixon Porter's fleet of 60 ships at the first and second battles of Fort Fisher, North Carolina, in December 1864 and January 1865. In the after-action report, Godon was noted for the support he provided and for the discipline and accurate firing of his ship, the Susquehanna. At the end of the war, there were 7 admirals in the United States Navy, including Laurel Hill East's John A. Dahlgren. Soon, Godon received his promotion to Rear Admiral and commanded the Brazil Squadron in 1866-67. His last active employment was as Commandant of the Brooklyn Navy Yard from May 1, 1868 until October 15, 1870. He retired from the Navy June 18, 1871, after 52 years. He moved back to his ancestral home in Blois, France. His and Sarah's daughter, Cecilia Victoria Godon, named after his sister, had died in 1864 at age 14 and was buried in Section F of Laurel Hill Cemetery. His son, Frederick William Godon, went to medical school in Maryland and moved to San Rafael, California, where he died unmarried and without children at age 34 in 1876. He left his estate to his mother. He was buried in the family plot. Now, Sarah Kirkbride Nevin Godon then died in 1877 in France. Her body was shipped home. It was interred in the family plot. She had made a will in 1873 that bequeathed the bulk of her estate to her husband, with the reservation that upon his death it should go to his natural heirs. She did not alter this will after Frederick died in California. Now, after she died, Admiral Godon had the will proved and reduced all her personal estate to his possession, and he held it until his death in 1879. He left a will that included the personal estate of his wife, but Cornelia Fry, a sister of Mrs. Godon, challenged the will. She was unsuccessful. After Admiral Godon's death on May 17, 1879, at his ancestral home in Blois, France, his body was shipped home, and 9 weeks later, it was received and buried at Laurel Hill Cemetery, Section F, Lot 14. Admiral George Melville, 1841-1912, the Jeannette Polar Quest. In the latter half of the 19th century, humans continued their efforts to explore and conquer various regions of the Earth. Many of these explorers were young men who had not served in the Civil War, They sought new challenges to prove their capabilities and experienced the same sense of achievement their fathers had attained on the battlefield. Their ambition was also driven by scientific curiosity, national pride, technological advancements, and the pursuit of adventure. The North Pole was one of the last unexplored regions on Earth. The Arctic held particular significance in examining climate patterns, ocean currents, and the aurora borealis phenomenon. Researchers sought to analyze how these elements impacted global weather and ecosystems. Many European nations were engaged in imperial expansion, which made exploration of the North Pole a matter of national pride. Claims to Arctic territories were closely associated with notions of power and prestige. The competition among countries, particularly Britain, the United States, and Russia, heightened the race to be the first to reach the North Pole. Successful expeditions would bring significant glory and recognition to the sponsoring nation. Now, the 19th century witnessed significant advancements in navigational instruments, including the chronometer and the sextant, which enhanced the feasibility of lengthy sea voyages. Additionally, the development of icebreakers and more robust ships specifically designed to endure severe Arctic conditions facilitated exploration efforts. Prominent vessels such as the HMS Resolute and the USS Jeannette were constructed specifically for polar explorations. This period was also significantly influenced by romantic ideals, which emphasized an appreciation for nature, the sublime, the heroic. The North Pole represented the pinnacle of adventure, characterized by its mystery and inherent dangers. Literature and art from this era romanticized the concept of exploration, which enhanced public curiosity and interest. When Mary Shelley wrote her novel Frankenstein in 1818, it featured a chase across ice floes through the Arctic region. Jules Verne made his contribution to Arctic literature in 1864 with the two-part Adventures of Captain Hatteras. It was published between 5 Weeks in a Balloon and Journey to the Center of the Earth. Edgar Allan Poe's only complete novel, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, tells of a whaling expedition that leads to the Antarctic area, but it draws parallels to Arctic exploration. The Arctic was a popular subject for painters. The Icebergs by Frederick Edwin Church in 1861, The Sea of Ice by Caspar David Friedrich, and Almost Everything by American William Bradford. In Walt Whitman's 1892 poem, Song of Myself, he says, "I take my place late at night in the crow's nest. We sail the Arctic Sea. It is plenty light enough. Through the clear atmosphere I stretch around on the wonderful beauty. The enormous masses of ice pass me, and I pass them. The scenery is plain in all directions. The white-topped mountains show in the distance. I fling out my fancies toward them." Before the time of astronauts and sports superstars, explorers were the heroes of the day. Newspapers not only followed their ventures, but sometimes sponsored them as they investigated the Earth, from the torrid zone of tropical jungles to the frigid zone of the ice-covered poles. As early as 1819, British Royal Naval officer William Edward Parry attempted unsuccessfully to reach the North Pole. In 1845, another Brit, John Franklin, took an ill-fated expedition to discover the Northwest Passage. His ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, were trapped in ice, and the entire crew was lost. The Franklin expedition sparked many search missions, including 2 by Laurel Hill East's Elijah Kent Kane. These were the heroes to be admired, and best-selling books of their adventures heightened interest in the Arctic. Then there was the search for a sea passage north of the North American continent. In his 1855 book, The Physical Geography of the Sea, Matthew Fontaine Maury, the father of modern oceanography, described an incident where a whale was caught near the Bering Strait, its flesh embedded with a harpoon from a vessel that only hunted near Greenland, on the other side of the North American continent. Now, the idea that a whale could swim around Cape Horn was improbable. That means it had to go through a northern passage. Since whales cannot stay under ice for very long, Maury concluded that an open polar sea must exist somewhere north of Canada. Although no one had ever seen such a body of water, it eventually became accepted as truth. The Northwest Passage has historically been a potential route for European and American explorers, envisioned as a waterway that connects the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans via the North American continent. Despite numerous attempts over centuries, the Northwest Passage was not successfully navigated until Roald Amundsen completed his voyage by ship between 1903 and 1906. And until 2009, Arctic pack ice blocked regular marine shipping through most of the year. Climate change in the Arctic Sea has made these waters much more accessible. The Canadian government asserts that the Northwestern Passages are within Canadian internal waters, while the United States maintains they are an international strait, allowing free and unrestricted passage. Although the Northeast Passage from the Pacific to the Atlantic was originally pursued by Russian sailors, the first confirmed complete transit from west to east was achieved by the Finnish-Swedish explorer Adolf Erik Nordenskjöld. This expedition took place on the Swedish ship Vega during 1878 to 1879. It was supported by royal funding from King Oscar II of Sweden. He's the man who's been depicted on sardine cans since 1902, and the culinary dish Veal Oscar is named in his honor. The Northeast Passage from America's west coast seemed to make more sense, as both wind and current on Earth generally run from west to east. There was also incorrectly thought to be a warm current from around Japan that heated the sea and kept it from freezing over. Now, for some, the North Pole's challenge was simply its unique location, where every direction you face is south. A German cartographer compared ignorance of the Arctic and the Antarctic with owning a house and not knowing what was in the attic or in the basement. The Arctic Circle is the southernmost latitude where on the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere, the sun remains below the horizon all day, and on the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere, the sun stays above the horizon all day. These events are known as polar night and midnight sun, respectively, and they become more pronounced as you move further north. In 1867, the United States had purchased Alaska from the Tsar for $7.2 million. That land remained mostly unexplored for many years, but it did give American explorers a new port to dock and resupply just below the Arctic Circle. Only 2 years before this, the Transcontinental Railroad allowed easier movement of people and supplies from coast to coast by land. That avoided the tedious months-long voyage around the Land of Fire, Tierra del Fuego, through the always perilous Straits of Magellan. 1871, Nature magazine called the quest for the North Pole the top scientific and geographical puzzle of the time. Plus, as I discussed way back earlier in the podcast, the philosophy of manifest destiny applied to acquisitions outside the continental United States. In July 1873, the U.S. Navy dispatched the USS Jeannette to Greenland to search for survivors of the ill-fated Polaris expedition, 1871 to 1873, which had fallen apart after its leader, Charles Francis Hall, was poisoned with arsenic by a crew member. Jeannette's second in command on this search and rescue mission was George W. DeLong, a 28-year-old graduate of the United States Naval Academy, in his first visit to the Arctic. Ice conditions prevented Jeannette from advancing beyond Upernavik in Greenland. But DeLong volunteered to take the ship's tender, a small steamer named Little Jeannette, in the hope of finding survivors at Cape York, a further 400 nautical miles north. His attempt failed. DeLong returned to Jeannette in mid-August after he found no trace of the Polaris crew. They had actually been rescued earlier, by a Scottish whaler. But it was on this trip that DeLong caught the polar virus. He was deeply fascinated by the Arctic, and he began to plan his own expedition. After he failed to secure government support for his venture, DeLong sought help from the owner and publisher of the New York Herald, James Gordon Bennett, Jr. Bennett was a man of considerable wealth. He had previously sponsored ambitious ventures, including the 1872 mission of Herald reporter Henry Morton Stanley to locate British missionary and explorer David Livingstone. Fortunately, Bennett shared DeLong's enthusiasm for Arctic exploration. He had actually dispatched 2 reporters with the Juniata. He'd already helped fund the Arctic voyage of a British ship, Pandora, in 1876-77. In fact, he thought that this former British naval gunboat might be appropriate for DeLong's venture, and he sent him to England to purchase the ship. It had already been to the Arctic region, although it got nowhere near the North Pole. For DeLong, the Pandora was love at first sight. It was a 3-masted ship, additionally equipped with a steam engine that powered a screw propeller. It was 146 feet long, with a beam of 25 feet and a draft of 15 feet when fully loaded and rigged. She carried 8 boats, including a steam cutter and 3 whaleboats. A definite plus for this ship was a sharply pointed bow that had already been reinforced so it could navigate and even ram its way through ice. The Pandora could accommodate 30 sailors comfortably, which aligned precisely with the number of men DeLong intended to take on his Arctic expedition. Her displacement was 570 tons. Bennett snapped up the vessel for $6,000, and he renamed it after his sister Jeannette. DeLong sailed the ship to France to be outrigged for its long voyage back to North America's west coast. Sailors are known for their superstitions. There was already a concern when this ship had been named after the mythological figure who unleashed a multitude of troubles upon humanity, that is, Pandora. Additionally, there is a prevalent belief among sailors that renaming a ship is ill-advised. It's bad luck. It is thought to insult the vessel's essence. Bennett utilized his connections in Washington, and the Jeannette was officially registered under the American flag and designated as a naval vessel. The next step was a journey from the French port of Le Havre, where the Jeannette was being made seaworthy, to its departure point in San Francisco. This was an 18,000-mile, 166-day journey from France to California, and they went non-stop. They ended 2 days after Christmas when there was a single bucket load of coal left in the Jeannette's bunker. The vessel would now require months of reinforcements and stocking before it was polar seaworthy, so DeLong took a week-long Union Pacific train ride back to Washington, D.C. to assemble the rest of his crew. While in France, he'd found his navigator, Master John Wilson Danenhauer, a 29-year-old Naval Academy graduate, who was recommended both by Bennett and by President Ulysses S. Grant. It was only once the trip back to the States was underway that Danenhauer confessed to DeLong that he had spent time in an asylum for a mental breakdown. It also became clear during the voyage that he was suffering from symptoms of tertiary syphilis. For engineer, DeLong wanted George Wallace Melville, a man he had worked with in the past and come to trust with his life. Melville was a distant relative of the author of seagoing stories, and as an engineer, he was the MacGyver of his day. He was 38 years old with a booming voice, a stout physique, an enormous bald head. He'd been raised in Brooklyn, and he had a sailor's vocabulary for which he was frequently reprimanded. But he didn't drink, he didn't gamble, and he really didn't have other vices. He was a self-taught expert in mineralogy, zoology, and many other subjects. Melville was educated at the Brooklyn Collegiate and Polytechnic Institute, which is now the New York University Tandon School of Engineering. It dates to 1854. He entered the Navy on July 29, 1861, and served as assistant engineer on several ships during the Civil War. He soon made himself invaluable to the Navy, which was reluctant to see him depart for a planned 2-year exploration. In 1867, Melville married Henrietta Beatty Waldron, and they had 3 children. They lived together in Sharon Hill, a suburb of Philadelphia. Hetty was a beautiful woman, but she was also an abuser of alcohol, and she had a terrible temper and a history of mental instability. Some of Melville's biographers have suggested that Hetty was the reason that George took long assignments away from home. In fact, during their 17 years of marriage, Melville was only home for about 4 years. Melville was always tinkering. When DeLong asked him whether something was possible, he would go to his workbench and sketch for several minutes, and most of the time he would report back to DeLong, "Yes, it can be done." DeLong said that Melville is one of the strong points of the expedition. I believe he could make an engine out of a few barrel hoops. He once improvised a pump out of flattened tin food containers attached to a windmill-like device to harness the power of the wind to work the pump. The Jeannette was officially commissioned as a U.S. naval ship on June 28, 1879. When it sailed from San Francisco Harbor on July 8th, it rode low in the water with 132 tons of coal and provisions for 30 men, enough to reach Alaska, which was the next possible place to refuel. For food, DeLong had purchased 27 tons of pemmican. That's a mixture of dried meat, berries, and fat, along with many canned goods. There were 13 barrels of pork, 800 gallons of alcohol, including brandy and beer. They figured that once they were back on land north of the Arctic Circle, they would hunt their own meat from local fauna. As prophylaxis against scurvy, he had a dozen barrels of concentrated lime juice. The ship had a well-stocked library and a first-class infirmary for the naval physician, Dr. Ambler. There was an arsenal of rifles and revolvers, a large collection of games and entertainments, musical instruments, even a small pump organ. There was scientific and astronomical equipment, along with cameras, a darkroom, and appropriate chemicals. DeLong consulted Alexander Graham Bell about the telephones that had made such a big impression at the Centennial Exposition 3 years earlier. He even considered taking hot air balloons, which would allow him to command a larger horizon than he could see from the crow's nest. One of the challenges faced in previous Arctic expeditions was the extended period of darkness during the winter months, and they knew that they were going to be frozen in for several months during the winter. DeLong consulted with Thomas Edison, who had not yet perfected his filament light bulbs. Edison provided Jeannette with 60 arc lights and a hand-cranked generator, plus a 2-horsepower motor to prevent sailors from becoming fatigued on the crank. The ship was equipped with a 400-gallon freshwater tank, which some people thought was inadequate. But this issue was resolved when Melville dismantled and rebuilt the ship's distiller, which had ensured an almost unlimited supply of fresh drinking water. After 23 days at sea heading north, Jeannette stopped at Unalaska in the middle of the Great Aleutian Chain, and they were assured by seal hunters on their way home from the north that the seas were free of ice. A coal ship, the Fanny Hyde, followed a few days later, and Jeannette restocked its fuel. And while they were in Alaska, they bought sleds and they hired 2 natives to handle the 40 dogs that they'd purchased. Now the crew was 33 men and only 31 dogs. 9 of the dogs died shortly after they were purchased and before they started off to sea. As Jeannette moved further north from Alaska, it encountered increasingly heavy ice. The restless dogs howled persistently when they were tied up, but they made a mess when they were allowed to roam the ship. By late September, Jeannette had become icebound, as expected, and settled in for a long winter of floating with the elements. Now, on the bright side, they were almost immediately able to hunt down a male and female bear on the ice floe, and they returned to the ship with 1,000 pounds of bear meat. DeLong ordered regular exercise on the ice and even organized football games. Attempts to get the electrical lights up and running were unsuccessful, despite constant tinkering and rebuilding by Melville. The same thing happened when they tried to run the copper telephone wires across the ice from the ship to experiments being conducted on the floe. But on the bright side, seals were plentiful. There was no chance of running out of meat anytime soon. They were vaguely aware that ingesting the livers of polar bears and walrus would make them very sick. But they did not know that it was because the livers were high in vitamin A, which is a fat-soluble vitamin that accumulates in the body. It can cause gastrointestinal, neurologic, and dermatologic symptoms. It's been estimated that consumption of 18 ounces of polar bear liver would result in a toxic dose for a human, hypervitaminosis A. They were drifting slowly, packed in ice, and erratically to the northwest. Temperatures were falling to below zero and would soon stay there. They were in polar darkness. In early November, the ice pack started to shift and broke up a little bit. The crew of Jeannette now had to adjust to the sounds of ice breaking and creaking all around. Now the ice began to bunch up, and it threatened the soundness of the ship. On November 12th, an enormous wall of ice worked its way toward Jeannette at a walking pace, and the crew realized they were about to be slammed and possibly crushed. They were squeezed from all sides, and the ship's hull timbers started to separate and pop, and the deck was forced up from its beams. The deck listed to a 10-degree angle, but the ship survived. Now it was listing, and it required everyone on board to walk with a lopsided gait. The floes slowly receded. The ship was left minimally damaged. They lost several more dogs who floated away before they could be brought back on board. But on the 24th, they broke free of ice for the first time in 10 weeks. They were still at the mercy of the elements. They drifted randomly and irregularly while they waited for the inevitable refreezing to occur. But so far, they had not lost a single crew member. When there was no snow for fresh water, Melville's rebuilt distiller was fired up and produced 40 gallons of salt-free water daily. As the waters around them refroze, DeLong started enforcing military discipline. For instance, unless you were on watch duty, you were required to be off the ship between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. every day for exercise, unless the temperature was lower than minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, on January 17th, 3 separate thermometers recorded the temperature at 42 below zero. The pressure of ice caused a structural failure, and Jeannette developed a leak. Seawater poured in at a rate of 60 gallons per minute. But within 48 hours, Melville had 2 steam-powered pumps operating, which required a significant amount of coal, but allowed enough water to be removed that the leak could be repaired. The men worked mostly in the dark. They had not seen the sun for 10 weeks by this time. They were down to 20 dogs, some of which had been made into pets and given names. Once the crew was awakened by the blood-curdling howls of a dog which had fallen asleep on the ice, but whose body heat had melted enough snow and ice to place him in a small crevice. And when the moisture refroze, the dog's hind legs had become trapped. They could not free the dog. He had to be sacrificed. As the long winter had passed into summer and the sun reappeared, Jeannette was still fast in the ice. As summer months passed with no thaw imminent, it looked as though Jeannette would spend yet another winter icebound. There were 56 tons of coal left. 36 tons had to be reserved for warming, cooking, and distilling. They started to think about abandoning the ship, but they were at least 250 miles away from Siberia. 16 months had passed without communication with the mainland, and the U.S. Navy was starting to plan a rescue mission. Thursday, June 9th, 1881, DeLong wrote in his journal, which he wrote in every day. Clear, bright, and pleasant weather. At midnight, such a snapping and crackling that I concluded we were in for a time. They actually started the preparation to abandon ship. And 2 days later, the ice crushed Jeannette with vengeance, and the ship began to tilt again. This time it reached 30 degrees to the starboard. The men had to hold on to something just to stay on their feet. Melville inspected the engine room. He concluded the ship was doomed. They frantically offloaded as much material as possible. The Jeannette, which had been the men's home for the prior 21 months, slipped beneath the waves and disappeared. The men were now in survival mode. They prepared the 3 boats and the 2 sleds that they had rescued as they started across the ice toward what they hoped was civilization. They traveled at night to avoid the sun's glare and snow blindness. Their ice pilot was a man named Dunbar. He had gone ahead and marked out a way with black flags. But the ice cracked open short of the second black flag and cut the strung-out party into 2. For the next week, the men and dogs dragged their 8-ton load of supplies across the ice looking for an open sea. And maddeningly, despite heading south, the sextant readings showed they were 28 miles further north than when they had started out because of the floes. Eventually, they got close enough to a landmass called Bennett Island. They were able to stop and regroup for a few days. DeLong decided to split the group into 3. George Melville was given charge of a whaleboat, even though Danenauer outranked him. Second Command Officer Charles W. Chipp and DeLong oversaw dinghies. They started off in a group together. But during a gale, the 3 boats were forced apart. Chipp's dinghy foundered. All 9 men disappeared and assumed drowned. DeLong and Melville both made it to the River Lena Delta, but they were about 80 miles apart in the spots where they landed, and each group assumed they were the only survivors. DeLong and his group found an abandoned hunting shack, but they could progress no further. DeLong sent his 2 strongest men out on their own and then waited and watched as each of his shipmates died. And DeLong recorded their passing meticulously in his notebook. He was among the last to die. When his body was found, his journal was 6 inches away from his shoulder. Melville's group of 11 reached the Delta after they had spent more than 120 hours in a cramped whaleboat. And on September 19th, they arrived on solid ground and they located a native fishing camp settlement. The natives there provided them with food and shelter despite limited communication abilities. During their stay, one crew member who spoke some Russian spoke with a tribe member and learned about 2 other Americans located in a village a couple of days away. Melville organized a dog team, and he headed to the village, and he found those 2 men from whom he had been separated 51 days earlier, the advance men that DeLong had sent out for help. Melville wanted to go back immediately. He could not. He had to wait for the winter freeze before he could head out to look for DeLong's party. They had arrived at the end of the summer. Now, they'd missed the mosquitoes. The mosquitoes were actually known to drive some men mad. But ice was starting to form on the river, and travel would not be safe until it was frozen solid. Melville used this time to compose 3 identical messages, one each to the U.S. minister at St. Petersburg, to the London office of the New York Herald, and to the Secretary of the Navy in Washington. He told of Jeannette's sinking and the activities afterward. He trusted these missives to a native courier who would have to travel more than 3,000 miles to a telegraph station in Irkutsk in southern Siberia. The first official report of the loss of Jeannette would not reach the outside world for another 6 weeks. Melville had not completely recovered from his own frostbite, but he took off with a fresh dog team again, this time to find DeLong and the rest of his men. But the person whom he had entrusted to supply his sled had shorted him and his team on food. Melville was back after 23 days of fruitless searching. He acknowledged that DeLong and his men were dead, and it would not matter if the recovery of their bodies waited until spring. It was time to come home. Some of the men he had left in the fishing camp had already been evacuated south to the fur-trading post Yakutsk. Melville traveled by reindeer and horse-drawn sled and crossed south of the Arctic Circle for the first time in 2 years. For a brief period, the 13 survivors out of 33 explorers were reunited. Now, before Melville could lead his band of scraggly survivors further south from Yakutsk to Irkutsk, he received an answer from the Secretary of Navy, Hunt. Omit no effort, spare no expense to recover his shipmates. So in the middle of February, with a newly organized party, George Wallace Melville was back in the hunt for DeLong's party. He found them March 24th, 1882. He took DeLong's pocket diary and he found the logs of the ship. He arranged for the burial of his shipmates. He designed a tomb on the crest of a hill 15 miles away. There was a strange funeral train of 9 fur-muffled men with 4 dog teams and 10 bodies lashed to sleds that made its way to the primitive cairn. 2 bodies were not found. A tall cross guarded the burial place. This cairn was duplicated at the cemetery of the Naval Academy, and it stands there today as a monument to the men of Jeannette. The Navy discussed the feasibility of bringing the bodies home for burial, but they soon realized that they would have to be hauled nearly 5,000 miles before they even reached a railroad. Nonetheless, the bodies of DeLong's party were recovered and brought home. DeLong and 5 of his crewmates are interred at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx under a magnificent statue. It must be 15 feet tall. It's a mustachioed polar explorer, knee-deep in snow, scanning the horizon. That is where you can now find George DeLong. Now, during his absence, George Melville was promoted to chief engineer. He finally made stateside on September 13th, where he was feted with a banquet at Delmonico's in New York before he took a special railroad car to Philadelphia for yet another reception at the Continental Hotel. After that, he headed home to Sharon Hill and Henrietta. He found that he had to answer for his wife's behavior. Before he had left 3 years earlier, Melville had made the mistake of writing Hetty a letter in which he expressed discomfort with Jeannette as a polar explorer and predicted that it would come to no end. After more than 2 years without her husband, Hetty sent a copy of the letter to George DeLong's wife, and she shared it with a local newspaper. Now, Melville was mortified by his wife's actions, and he chastised her soundly. The argument continued until after bedtime, when frustrated George grabbed his pillow and headed to the parlor to sleep. Hetty followed him, imploring and threatening. Melville grabbed his jacket and slammed out of the house. He walked 2 miles along the Chester Pike to a friend's house in Derby, and he started arrangements to have his wife locked up in an asylum. The next morning, 2 doctors and a carriage showed up to take her away. When George went to awaken her, he made sure to remove the pistol that he knew she always kept under her pillow. She was locked up at Norristown State Asylum for the insane, and the daughters were cared for by George's sister. Now, during the first week of November, Melville testified at a naval hearing in Washington, D.C., and he was questioned about the fitness of Jeannette. He testified, "I expressed myself as fully satisfied with all her fittings and strength." Afterwards, he returned to Philadelphia, where he was assigned duty in the Navy Yard. Hetty had been judged as unfit for treatment as insane and was released. Divorce and a battle over the 3 daughters followed, as well as a suit by Henrietta for false imprisonment. That was eventually dropped. George Melville achieved the rank of chief engineer in 1881. He worked as inspector of coal from 1884 to 1886, and then he concluded his seagoing service on the new cruiser Atlanta. On August 9, 1887, President Grover Cleveland appointed Melville as Chief of the Bureau of Steam Engineering with a relative rank of Commodore. As head of Navy propulsion for more than 15 years, Melville oversaw the design of 120 new Navy ships. He introduced key innovations such as water tube boilers, triple screw propulsion, vertical engines, floating repair ships, distilling ships, often against conservative naval opinion. Melville entirely reformed the service when he put Navy engineers on a professional rather than an artisanal footing. George W. Melville was promoted to the rank of Rear Admiral on March 3, 1899. He successfully lobbied Congress for a $400,000 appropriation to establish an experimental and testing laboratory in Annapolis, which started operations in 1903. His primary justification for the establishment of this facility was that it would enhance the efficiency of the Navy. Admiral Melville's proposal sought to create a reliable method for pre-installation testing of machinery and equipment intended for naval vessels. Additionally, he contended that the laboratory would aid in the training of engineering officers and therefore advocated for its location in Annapolis, adjacent to the Naval Academy. Before his retirement, Melville chaired a committee assigned to investigate the feasibility of using fuel oil in Navy boilers as an alternative to coal. The committee firmly recommended the establishment of a testing facility to examine methods of fuel combustion in Navy boilers. And on November 18, 1910, the Secretary of the Navy authorized, quote, the construction and equipment at an estimated cost of $10,000 of a structure simulating a naval fire room for the purpose of investigating the subject of fuel oil burning in connection with the design of proposed oil-burning battleships in an existing building at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Admiral Melville retired on January 10, 1903. He spent his last years in Philadelphia. He stayed active as an advisor. His first wife, Hetty, died in 1893. She was buried in Washington, D.C. Melville married Estella Smith Polis in 1907, but she died 2 years later and was buried in the family mausoleum at Laurel Hill East. Melville received numerous honors, both nationally and internationally. He was a founding member of the National Geographic Society, a companion in the Naval Order of the United States. He joined the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, Malus, in 1884, and twice served as their commander. Melville was part of the Grand Army of the Republic, an honorary member and 18th President of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, and an elected member of the American Philosophical Society. Admiral George Wallace Melville died in Philadelphia on St. Patrick's Day, March 17, 1912. The wake was at his home at 620 North 18th Street. He had updated his will less than a month before his death, and he left an estate of about $500,000. $150,000 was to go into a fund to place aged and deserving poor persons in various institutions. He also left $5,000 to the Mechanical Engineering School at the University of Pennsylvania, and $10,000 each to his daughters and several grandchildren. Interment took place in his wife's family mausoleum, where a full complement of Marines fired over the grave. One of the many dignitaries who attended his funeral was Rear Admiral Robert E. Peary, who had accomplished what Melville and the crew of Jeannette had failed to do. In April 1909, Peary reached the North Pole with Matthew Henson, who may have actually gotten there first. Peary named the Melville Glacier and Melville Land in Greenland after him. The U.S. Navy has named 2 ships in his honor, the destroyer tender USS Melville and the oceanographic research ship USNS Melville. Melville, Montana was named in his honor in 1877. The Navy's George W. Melville Award acknowledges notable engineering contributions in applying knowledge toward research and development of materials, devices, systems, or methods, including design, development, and integration of prototypes and new processes. The Melville Medal is presented periodically by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers for the best original paper from its transactions. Melville Hall was built in 1937 on the campus of the United States Naval Academy. It is used as classroom and laboratory space for the steam and electrical engineering departments. Melville also apparently made friends with two of the best-known artists in the city. Thomas Eakins painted his portrait twice. The first version in full uniform. It's gorgeous. Both of them are gorgeous portraits. The first version from 1904 is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The second from the next year is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. There's a statue of Admiral Melville in Navy Park at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard that was created by Samuel Murray, a man often rumored to be Eakins' lover. His mausoleum is easily overlooked. The whole thing could use a power washing. It is ramshackle in appearance. The door is sealed shut with a concrete slab. There's a list of names engraved. Blink twice and you will miss it. But the last name on this list is that of one of the greatest polar explorers and naval engineers who ever lived, Admiral George Wallace Melville. For the mid-April edition of Biographical Bites from Bala, Laurel Hill Stories, number 43, it's Polish violinist Timothy Adamowski, who led a popular trio in 19th century Boston and was the first conductor of the Boston Pops. He married the daughter of a famous Philadelphia surgeon and is buried at Laurel Hill West. In May, All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, number 74, we leave the 19th century American Navy for the killing fields of France during the Great War. Major Alfred Reginald Allen trained as a neurosurgeon, but he joined the Army as an artillery officer. He was killed in action during the Battle of Meuse Argonne. Captain Allen Woods Lukens was killed at the Argonne and received a posthumous Distinguished Service Cross. Private Henry G. Prediger was killed at Chateau Thierry, while Lieutenant Dilwyn Perry Starr joined the British Army and was killed at the Battle of Somme. All four are buried in France, but they have cenotaphs at Laurel Hill. That podcast will be released on May 1st of 2025. Laurel Hill East is located at 3822 Ridge Avenue in the East Falls section of Philadelphia. It's an easy walk from the bus stop at Ridge at Allegheny for SEPTA buses 1, 62, and 82. The old R bus is now 82. Admission and parking in the lot across the street are free, although parking spaces are limited. There are a couple of parking spaces on the grounds now. We have recaptured those after a lot of work at the gatehouse. You can also pull into the grounds and park where you know you won't block anyone. There is an app that you can download for self-guided tour through its 78 acres. Laurel Hill West is at 225 Belmont Avenue in Bala Kidwood, with parking at the main entrance and at the bell tower. Public transportation, take SEPTA Regional Rail to Manayunk or one of the many buses to the Wissahickon Transfer Center on Ridge Avenue, then cross that footbridge, cross the Schuylkill River on the Pencoid footbridge, the pedestrian bridge, come up Writers Ferry Road to the entrance near the Pet Cemetery. If you download the audios I have done for self-guided tours of Laurel Hill West, they will each lead you on a 40 to 45-minute audio tour that talks about people who were interred along the route through the cemetery. Both Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West are currently open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Please come. Just come to walk. We welcome dog walkers. Of course, we want you to pick up after yourself. Don't let your dog off the lead. Bike riders, photographers, painters, bird watchers, tree and plant lovers, skateboarders, even strollers, the two-footed and four-wheeled variety. If you follow us on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok, you will get reminders of our inhabitants and activities. If you follow All Bones Considered on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok, we've now reached 65,000 downloads. Once you've fallen in love with these hot spots, become a friend of Laurel Hill. You'll have the opportunity for several members-only special tours that are conducted each year, including some inside the mausoleum visits. They may be cemeteries, but they are a couple of the liveliest spots in town. The key to finding the gift shop online, click on Support, and Gift Shop is in the left-hand column. Our theme song, Names at Peace, was written and performed by local artist James Harrow. All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, and Biographical Bites from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories are researched, written, narrated, and produced by me, Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine at Temple University. You can reach me through my email, jrlexjr1947@gmail.com. Remember to keep body and soul together until next time on All Bones Considered Laurel Hill Stories, where the plot thickened. Stick around to hear the bibliography, the references that I use for this podcast. And until the next time we meet, stay safe, stay well, and stay above ground. Bibliography is up next. I'm not sure what Russ Dodge used as his references for Isaac Hull, so I'm not able to give you the bibliography on that. For David Conner, a couple of books. One is The Story of the Mexican War by Robert Self, that's S-E-L-P-H, last name Henry. That is a Da Capo paperback, copyright 1950, by the Bobbs Merrill Company, Incorporated. The other book is On Contested Shores, the evolving role of amphibious operations in the history of warfare. It's edited by Timothy Heck and B.A. Friedman. It's published by Marine Corps University Press, Quantico, Virginia, 2020. The chapter on Vera Cruz is Chapter 5. It's called Vera Cruz 1847 by J. Overton. There's a monograph that's called Commodore Connor, Note on Maclay's History of the United States Navy-Mexican War. It's by P.S.P. Connor, Philip Connor, his son, from the United Service Review, July 1895. Remember I told you that his son kept his memory alive. Another book by Philip Singh Physic Connor was The Castle of San Juan de Ulua and the Topsy-Turvyists. That's a brief monograph. It's only 33 pages. I believe it was printed privately because I do not see a publisher's note on the page. It does say Philadelphia 1897, though. And then there's the Home Squadron under Commodore Connor in the Mexican War, also by his son, Philip Singh Physic Connor. That one is 1896, and again, privately printed. Copyright by Philip Singh Physic Connor, 1896. For Sylvanus William Godon, the book that I used most was Hanging Captain Gordon by Ron Soodalter, S-O-O-D-A-L-T-E-R. The subtitle is The Life and Trial of an American Slave Trader. This is by Atria Books, A-T-R-I-A, 1230 Avenue of the Americas, New York, copyright 2006 by Ron Soodalter. There's an article in the winter 1972 edition of Expedition magazine. It's called Cruise of the United States Frigate Potomac by Karen Goodrich Hedrick and John D. Hedrick. And it has a lot of detail, believe it or not, about past midshipman Sylvanus W. Godon. An article that I really enjoyed is called Blind Justice, the United States Failure to Curb the Illegal Slave Trade. It's by Randy J. Sparks. It was published in Law and History Review, February 2017, volume 35, number 1, pages 53 to 59. Other than that, it was a lot of newspaper articles about Godon. There's one from 1848 called A Mexican Prize, another article, Captain Godon from 1862, and then his obituary, as it was in the New York Times, Lancaster newspaper, Vermont newspaper, his will, his burial. Now, for George W. Melville, I cannot recommend too much the book Icebound, The Jeannette Expedition's Quest for the North Pole, by Leonard F. Guttridge, Guttridge. This is the Naval Institute Press out of Annapolis, Maryland, copyright 1986. If you can find a copy, this is a hair-raising book. This reminded me of some of the work that I've read a couple of John Krakauer's books. This is written like John Krakauer would write it. It just keeps you on the edge of your seat all the way through. Another book that is probably equal to it, although I did not finish reading it, is by Hampton Sides. It's called In the Kingdom of Ice, the Grand and Terrible Polar Voyage of the USS Jeannette. This is Doubleday, New York, London, Toronto, Sydney, Auckland. Copyright 2014. This is a relatively recent book then. Both of these are real. If you like adventure stories, if you liked the Aubrey Maturin series, for instance, about Captain Jack Aubrey, you should read these books about the Jeannette expedition. They are absolutely hair-raising, as I say. There's an interesting article I referenced only briefly. It's called Gothic Nature, New Directions in Eco-Horror and the Eco-Gothic. It's from a journal called Gothic Nature, issue 4. One of the articles in this, for instance, is called Defrosting the Gothic, Arctic Poetry in a Melting Sublime. I did use parts of Melville's book. It's called In the Lena Delta, a narrative of the search for Lieutenant Commander DeLong and his companions, followed by an account of the Greeley Relief Expedition and a proposed method of reaching the North Pole by George W. Melville, Chief Engineer, U.S. Navy. Edited by Melville Phillips, with maps and illustrations. That's Houghton Mifflin and Company, Boston, New York, and that is copyright 1884. You can find that at Archive online. And another book that I dipped into briefly, it's actually more of a monograph than a book. It's less than 40 pages. It's called Views of Commodore George W. Melville, Chief Engineer of the Navy, as to the strategic and commercial value of the Nicaraguan Canal, which eventually, of course, became the Panama Canal, the future control of the Pacific Ocean, the strategic value of Hawaii and its annexation to the United States. More Manifest Destiny. That is from the Government Printing Office in Washington in 1898. There were also several contemporary newspaper articles since I did have access to the New York Herald of those days. There are a lot more naval people I could talk about. I did not go into the Civil War. I avoided that in this podcast. So I'll have to swing back and talk about the Navy in the Civil War at some point. And then I can talk about people from the 20th century, like Oliver Grafton Kirk, who was an admiral during the Second World War. He was buried at Laurel Hill West. So there's plenty more as far as Navy topics. Listen, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed listening to this as much as I enjoyed putting it together. I learned so much, and believe me, the polar exploration stuff hit hard reading about what these guys went through. I don't know if I could have lasted a full day in that environment, and yet they lasted for more than 2 years. It's insane. Maybe I'll see you at the cemetery. I hope you come back for more podcasts. Stay safe, stay well, stay above ground.